Hi everyone, welcome to Ricktopus. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that Morty Smith from Rick and Morty shows signs of trauma throughout the series. And by examining his baseline personality, his repeated exposure to violence, the psychological strain from extreme events, his emotional changes over time, and his explicit statements about having PTSD, we can understand how the show uses his character to explore what happens when someone experiences repeated traumatic events without time to process or recover. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free, and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. Morty's baseline personality before significant trauma. When Rick and Morty begins in the pilot episode from December 2013, Morty Smith is introduced as a 14-year-old boy with a very specific personality profile that provides important context for understanding his later development. A psychologist observing Morty in these early episodes would describe him as nervous, anxious, empathetic, and deeply uncomfortable with danger and violence. This baseline personality is important to establish because it provides a reference point for understanding how Morty changes over the course of the series as he experiences increasingly traumatic events. In the beginning, Morty is not someone who seeks out adventure or danger for excitement or thrills. He is someone who gets pulled into dangerous situations by Rick against his will, and who reacts to those situations with fear, distress, and moral concern that reflect his natural temperament and values. The pilot episode establishes Morty's character immediately and clearly from the opening scenes. Rick drags Morty out of bed in the middle of the night while Morty is sleeping peacefully to take him on an adventure to another dimension. Morty does not want to go on this adventure. He is scared by being woken up suddenly, confused about what is happening, and protests that he has school in the morning and needs to sleep. Throughout the adventure that follows, Morty is visibly terrified by everything happening around him. He questions Rick's decisions repeatedly, he expresses fear about the dangers they face, and he shows clear distress about the violence happening around him. When they encounter armed security guards who shoot at them with weapons designed to kill, Morty screams and panics rather than responding with excitement or bravery. When Rick's plan goes wrong and they nearly die in an explosion that could have killed them both, Morty is not excited or thrilled by the close call or the adrenaline. He is genuinely frightened and upset by how close they came to being killed, and by the realization that Rick's plans are not always safe or reliable. A psychologist would observe that Morty's initial reactions to danger are what you would expect from a normal 14-year-old boy who has not been exposed to repeated trauma or violence in his life up to this point. He shows appropriate fear responses to genuinely dangerous situations that threaten his life and safety. His anxiety is proportional to the actual threats he faces, rather than being exaggerated or minimized in ways that would suggest emotional dysregulation. His distress is understandable and reasonable given what he is experiencing in these extreme situations. There is nothing abnormal or concerning about Morty's emotional responses in these early episodes, except perhaps that he is being exposed to situations that no child should be exposed to in the first place. His fear response is healthy and adaptive, designed to protect him from danger by motivating avoidance of life-threatening situations and by signaling to others that he needs protection and support. The episode Me Seeks and Destroy from Season 1 provides more insight into Morty's baseline personality and his emotional needs as a young teenager. In this episode, Morty insists on choosing an adventure for once instead of always doing what Rick wants without any input or consideration for Morty's preferences. Morty chooses a fantasy adventure that he thinks will be fun and safe, showing that his natural preference when given a choice is for adventures that are less dangerous and more enjoyable rather than the extreme danger Rick usually exposes him to, without asking. He wants to go on an adventure that feels more like play and exploration, and less like survival and combat. During the adventure, when things start going wrong and become violent and dangerous in ways Morty did not anticipate, Morty's response is anxiety and distress. He did not anticipate the violence and danger that unfolds, and when it happens, he is not emotionally equipped to handle it without significant distress and fear. There is a scene in this episode where Morty encounters a character named Jellybean, who is the king of the village they visit, and this character attempts to assault Morty in a bathroom while they are at a tavern. Morty's response to this attempted assault is pure fear and distress, without any numbing or detachment to protect him from the experience. He fights back physically to escape from the situation, using whatever strength and resistance he can muster to get away. Afterward, he is visibly shaken and traumatized by what almost happened to him. A psychologist would note that Morty's response here is a normal trauma response to attempted assault. He experiences experiences fear during the event, he fights to protect himself when he recognizes the danger, and he shows clear emotional distress afterward that does not immediately resolve. This is Morty's baseline response to a traumatic event, before he has been exposed to dozens or hundreds of such events that might change how he processes trauma. What is psychologically important about this scene is that Morty's distress is visible and genuine, rather than hidden or suppressed behind a mask of being okay. He is not hardened or desensitized to what happened. He does not brush off what happened or make jokes about it to deflect from his feelings. He is clearly affected by the experience in ways that show through his behavior and demeanor. This shows that early in the series, Morty still has normal emotional responses to traumatic events that have not been dulled by repeated exposure. He feels fear intensely. He feels violation deeply. He feels distress acutely. These responses indicate that his emotional processing is still functioning normally and healthily, even if the events themselves are abnormal and unhealthy for a child to experience. The episode Rick Potion number 9 inches from Season 1 provides perhaps the most important baseline data about Morty's psychology before chronic trauma begins to accumulate. In this episode, Rick helps Morty create a love potion to make his crush Jessica fall in love with him, so Morty can have a date to the school dance. The potion goes catastrophically wrong and spreads through the entire human population, turning everyone on Earth into monsters who are obsessed with Morty. Rick's attempts to fix the problem only make it worse, creating increasingly horrifying mutations that transform humans into grotesque creatures. Eventually, Rick's solution is to abandon their entire dimension and move to a dimension where alternate versions of themselves just died in an unrelated accident, so they can take their places and live as those versions. Morty's emotional response to this situation provides crucial information about his baseline psychology. Throughout the episode, as the situation escalates from bad to catastrophic, Morty becomes increasingly distressed and overwhelmed. He feels responsible for what happened because he asked Rick to make the potion in the first place, taking on guilt for consequences he could not have foreseen. He is horrified by the mutations and the destruction of human civilization. He is overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. When Rick tells Morty they are going to abandon their dimension and their family, Morty protests strongly. He does not want to leave his family behind, even though they have been transformed into monsters. He does not want to accept that everyone he knows has been permanently changed. The ending of this episode is particularly significant for understanding Morty's baseline emotional state. Rick and Morty arrive in the new dimension and find the bodies of their alternate selves who just died in an explosion. Rick tells Morty to help him bury the bodies so they can assume these alternate versions' lives. Morty has to physically dig a grave and bury his own dead body. This is an intensely traumatic experience. After burying the bodies, Morty sits on the ground in shock, staring at nothing. A psychologist would recognize this as an acute stress response to overwhelming trauma. What is psychologically significant is that this experience clearly affects Morty. He does not bounce back immediately. The episode ends with Morty at the dinner table with his family, who do not know what just happened. Morty is quiet and withdrawn. He is processing the fact that this is not really his family, that his real family is in another dimension, and that he just buried his own corpse. A psychologist would observe that Morty is experiencing the initial stages of processing a traumatic event. He is in shock, he is withdrawing emotionally, and he is struggling to integrate what happened. This episode establishes that Morty, at his baseline, is capable of being deeply affected by traumatic events. He is not naturally resilient to extreme trauma. He is not emotionally hardened or indifferent to disturbing experiences. He is a sensitive, empathetic teenager who reacts to trauma with appropriate distress, shock, and emotional pain. A psychologist would also note some of Morty's positive baseline characteristics that are relevant to understanding trauma responses. Morty shows strong empathy for others throughout early episodes. He cares about people getting hurt. He feels guilty when his actions contribute to harm. He has a moral compass that causes him distress when he witnesses or participates in things he believes are wrong. These characteristics of empathy and moral sensitivity mean that Morty is particularly vulnerable to certain types of trauma, specifically moral trauma that occurs when someone is forced to participate in or witness events that violate their values. In the episode Anatomy Park from Season 1, Morty shows concern for the people inside the body they are exploring, even though these people are strangers to him. When people die during the adventure, Morty reacts with distress and guilt, even though he was not directly responsible for their deaths. A psychologist would observe that Morty's empathy makes him emotionally vulnerable because he internalizes the suffering of others. Another relevant baseline characteristic is Morty's relationship with authority, specifically his relationship with Rick. In early episodes, Morty generally trusts Rick and believes that Rick knows what he is doing. When Rick tells Morty something is safe or necessary, Morty usually accepts this, even when he is scared. This trust means that Morty often goes along with situations that frighten him because he believes Rick will protect him. A psychologist would note that this dynamic makes Morty vulnerable when that trust is violated through experiences where Rick's judgment turns out to be poor. Morty's baseline also includes significant anxiety that exists even before major trauma. In several early episodes, Morty is shown struggling with school, feeling insecure about his intelligence, and worrying about social acceptance. The episode M. Night Shame Aliens from Season 1 shows Morty's insecurities about his academic performance. A psychologist would note that pre-existing anxiety can make someone more vulnerable to developing trauma responses after stressful events. The episode Raising Gazorpazorp from Season 1 shows more of Morty's baseline personality through his relationship with his alien son. When Morty accidentally creates a child, his response is to try to be a good father despite being completely unprepared. He shows nurturing instincts and concern for his child's well-being. A psychologist would observe that these caregiving instincts are part of Morty's core personality. What all of these early episodes establish is that Morty begins the series as an emotionally sensitive, empathetic, anxious teenager who is not naturally suited for the extreme violence and danger of the adventures Rick takes him on. His emotional responses to danger and trauma are normal and appropriate. He feels fear when threatened, distress when harmed, and guilt when his actions lead to bad outcomes. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. From this baseline of normal emotional sensitivity and appropriate trauma responses, repeated exposure to violence and death gradually begins to affect Morty's psychological functioning in observable ways. Section 2. Repeated exposure to life-threatening violence. After establishing Morty's baseline personality as a sensitive, empathetic teenager with normal emotional responses to danger and trauma, the series proceeds to expose him to repeated, life-threatening violence across dozens of adventures spanning multiple seasons and years of storytelling. A psychologist observing this pattern would note that repeated exposure to violence, particularly without adequate time to process each traumatic event before the next one occurs, creates conditions under which trauma responses are likely to develop and intensify over time. Morty does not experience one or two traumatic events and then return to normal life with time and space to recover and heal. He experiences traumatic events constantly, sometimes multiple times per week based on the timeline the show presents, with no breaks for recovery or processing between incidents. The episode Rick Potion number 9 inches from Season 1, which was discussed in the previous section as part of Morty's baseline assessment, actually marks the beginning of Morty's exposure to what a psychologist would classify as severe trauma that exceeds normal capacity to cope. The experience of watching the entire human race transform into monsters because of a potion he asked Rick to create, of taking responsibility for causing this catastrophe that destroyed civilization, of abandoning his original family and dimension permanently, and of having to bury his own corpse and assume the life of an alternate version of himself, represents multiple layers of traumatic exposure happening simultaneously and compounding each other. This is not a single traumatic event that can be processed over time. It is a cascade of traumatic experiences compressed into a short period with no opportunity for processing or recovery between each distinct trauma. What makes this psychologically significant is that this extremely traumatic experience is not treated as a major life event that requires extensive processing and recovery time afterward. The next episode begins with Morty back to going on adventures with Rick as as if the previous episode never happened, as if burying his own body was just another day. A psychologist would observe that this pattern, where severe trauma is followed immediately by a return to normal activities without any processing or recovery period, is exactly the kind of pattern that leads to unprocessed trauma accumulating in someone's psychology in ways that create lasting problems. The trauma does not get processed and integrated into the person's understanding of themselves and their experiences. Instead, it gets pushed aside to make room for the next experience, and the emotional impact remains unresolved beneath the surface. The episode A Wrinkle in Time from Season 2 shows Morty and Rick dealing with the consequences of time being split into multiple, uncertain realities after they froze time for too long. During this adventure, Morty and Rick are at risk of being frozen in time permanently, which would essentially be death or ceasing to exist. There is a moment where Rick appears to sacrifice himself to save Morty, giving Morty the certainty collar while Rick remains in uncertainty. Morty believes Rick is dead or lost forever in that moment. The emotional impact of believing his grandfather died specifically to save him would be significant and would create complex feelings of grief, gratitude, and guilt. Then Rick survives through his own methods, and Morty experiences relief that Rick is alive. However, there is also confusion about whether Rick's sacrifice meant something emotionally significant about Rick caring for Morty, or whether it was just a calculation. A psychologist would note that this experience of nearly losing someone close to you, combined with uncertainty about what that person's actions mean about their feelings, creates emotional confusion and stress that adds to Morty's accumulating traumatic experiences without providing clear resolution. The episode Total Recall from Season 2 exposes Morty to a different type of psychological trauma that involves confusion about reality and forced violence. Parasites infiltrate the house and implant false memories in everyone's minds, creating confusion about what is real and what is manufactured. Morty is forced to shoot and kill beings who he believes are friends and family members, even though they turn out to be parasites pretending to be people. A psychologist would recognize that the experience of killing what you believe to be people you care about, even if they turn out not to be real, would be traumatic because the emotional experience during the killing is real. The act of pulling the trigger while believing you are killing a family member creates genuine psychological distress, regardless of what the target actually is. The confusion about what memories are real and what experiences actually happened would also be psychologically destabilizing in profound ways, creating uncertainty about the reliability of Morty's own mind and memories, which undermines his sense of what he can trust about his perceptions. The episode Look Who's Purging Now from Season 2 exposes Morty to large-scale violence and killing on a massive scale. Rick and Morty visit a planet during a purge where all crime is legal for one night, and they end up participating in extreme violence and killing during this period. Morty initially resists the violence strongly, consistent with his baseline empathetic personality and moral values. He does not want to hurt people and tries to avoid the killing happening around them. However, as the episode progresses and the situation becomes more chaotic, Morty gets caught up in the violence himself, participating in killing people in ways that go beyond simple self-defense. A psychologist would observe that this represents a form of moral trauma, where Morty is pushed beyond his own ethical boundaries and forced to do things that violate his values about right and wrong. The fact that he gets caught up in the violence and goes beyond just protecting himself shows how extreme situations can override normal moral inhibitions and push people to act in ways they would never choose under normal circumstances. This is a recognized phenomenon in psychology, and one that can create lasting guilt and shame afterward when the person reflects on their actions and realizes they violated their own principles. The episode The Wedding Squanchers from Season 2 ends with Rick turning himself in to the Galactic Federation to protect the family from being hunted as fugitives. From Morty's perspective, he witnesses his grandfather sacrifice himself and get taken away by Federation forces, not knowing if he will ever see Rick again or what will happen to Rick while in custody. A psychologist would note that watching a close family member be taken by authorities, not knowing their fate or whether they are suffering, represents a form of ambiguous loss that can be particularly difficult to process psychologically. Unlike a clear loss through death, where you can grieve and eventually move forward, ambiguous loss leaves the person in a state of not knowing and unable to grieve properly or move forward. Morty then lives for a period without Rick while Earth is occupied by the Federation, adding to his stress and trauma exposure during this time of uncertainty. The episode The Rick Shank Rickdemption from Season 3 shows Earth under Federation control, with Morty and his family living in this occupied reality where they must follow alien laws. When Rick eventually escapes from prison and overthrows the Federation by collapsing their economy, Morty is caught up in the chaos and violence of this rebellion and its aftermath. A psychologist would observe that even when Morty is not directly participating in violence himself, simply being present during violent events and experiencing the fear and chaos of those events contributes to trauma accumulation in significant ways. You do not have to be the one causing violence to be traumatized by exposure to it. The episode Pickle Rick from Season 3 includes significant violence that Morty is exposed to, even though Rick is the one performing the violent acts. Rick, while in pickle form after transforming himself to avoid family therapy, fights his way through a building full of armed guards, killing many people in graphic ways. While Morty is not directly involved in this violence and does not witness it happening, he is aware of it and sees the aftermath when Rick arrives home. A psychologist would note that exposure to violence does not require direct participation or direct witnessing to be traumatic and create psychological effects. Knowing that violence occurred and seeing its aftermath can contribute to trauma responses. The episode The Rick Lantis Mix-Up from Season 3 shows various Ricks and Mortys in the Citadel living their lives. This episode is relevant psychologically because it shows that across infinite dimensions, Mortys are consistently being traumatized, abused, and exposed to violence by their Ricks. While our specific Morty is not the focus, the episode suggests that trauma exposure is a universal experience for Mortys across the multiverse, reinforcing the pattern we observe. The episode, Rest and Ricklaxation from Season 3, begins by showing Rick and Morty returning from an adventure that was so traumatic that they both seek therapy through a spa treatment that removes their negative emotions. The episode opens with them stumbling out of a portal, looking exhausted and traumatized. A psychologist would observe that this episode explicitly acknowledges that Morty is accumulating trauma from his adventures, to the point where he recognizes he needs help. The fact that Morty seeks treatment suggests that he is aware at some level that the adventures are affecting him psychologically in ways he cannot manage alone. The episode The Rickchurian Morty Date from Season 3 shows Morty becoming more assertive with Rick and pushing back against Rick's control. While this could be seen as healthy growth, a psychologist might also observe that changes in assertiveness and increased irritability can be trauma responses. Morty's increased willingness to challenge Rick might reflect both maturation and also frustration and anger building up from repeated exposure to situations he did not choose. The episode Edge of Tomorty, Rick Die Rick Pete from Season 4 involves Rick dying repeatedly and transferring his consciousness to clone bodies. Each time Rick dies, Morty witnesses his grandfather's death in various ways. A psychologist would note that repeatedly watching someone you care about die, even if they come back moments later, would be emotionally traumatizing because each death registers as a loss, even if that loss is quickly reversed. The episode The Vat of Acid episode from Season 4 involves Rick creating a save point device that allows Morty to reset reality. Morty uses this device to develop a relationship and live what feels like a full life before discovering Rick manipulated the device and none of it was real from the other person's perspective. A psychologist would observe that this represents profound betrayal and psychological manipulation that creates trauma through loss of something Morty believed was real and meaningful. The episode Mort Dinner Rick Andre from Season 5 shows Morty dealing with ongoing stress from his relationship with Rick while being exposed to time manipulation that creates confusion. A psychologist would note that chronic stress from an unstable relationship combined with ongoing unusual experiences contributes to cumulative stress burden even when individual events are not severely traumatic. The episode Rick Dependent Spray from Season 5 exposes Morty to public humiliation when his sperm become giant monsters that threaten Earth. The shame of this situation, combined with continued exposure to danger, represents trauma related to embarrassment as well as violence. The episode A Mortican Grickfitty from Season 5 involves Morty being tricked into dangerous situations. A psychologist would observe that repeated patterns of deception create trust violations that compound with the physical dangers. Throughout these episodes, across multiple seasons, a psychologist would observe several patterns in Morty's trauma exposure. First, the frequency is extremely high, with potentially traumatic events occurring multiple times per week. Second, the severity ranges from moderate to extreme, with some events representing severe trauma by any standard. Third, the variety of trauma types is broad, including direct physical danger, witnessing violence, participating in killing, moral violations, loss and grief, betrayal, psychological manipulation, reality confusion, and chronic stress. Fourth, the recovery time between traumatic events is minimal to non-existent, with new traumas occurring before previous ones can be processed. A psychologist would recognize this pattern as creating conditions where trauma responses are not just possible or likely, they are almost inevitable. The human psychological system is designed to process and recover from traumatic events. Yet this requires time, safety, and support. When traumatic events occur in rapid succession without adequate recovery periods, the processing system becomes overwhelmed and trauma begins to accumulate in ways that affect ongoing functioning. Morty's exposure pattern represents exactly the kind of repeated, varied, severe trauma without recovery that creates high risk for developing chronic trauma responses. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These experiences of repeated violence and danger without time to recover set the stage for the persistent psychological strain that begins to visibly affect Morty's emotional state and functioning across later seasons. Section 3. Persistent psychological strain from extreme events. A psychologist observing Morty across multiple seasons would note that his traumatic experiences are not isolated incidents separated by long periods of normal life and recovery. They are constant, escalating, and cumulative in ways that create persistent psychological strain without relief. When we talk about psychological strain, we are describing the ongoing pressure and stress that accumulates in someone's mind and emotions when they are exposed to difficult experiences without adequate time to process and recover between events. For most people, when something traumatic happens, they have time afterward to rest, to talk about what happened, to make sense of it, and to gradually return to feeling normal before the next stressful event occurs. This recovery time is essential for psychological health because it allows the mind to process the experience and to restore its normal functioning. Morty does not get this recovery time. Instead, he experiences a pattern where traumatic events happen constantly, where each new adventure brings new dangers and new psychological challenges, and where the strain from previous experiences never gets resolved before new strain is added on top of it. The episode Morty Night Run from Season 2 shows this pattern of constant strain without relief. In this episode, Morty and Rick go to an alien arcade, and Morty accidentally helps an assassin escape who then goes on to potentially cause massive destruction. Morty feels responsible for whatever harm this assassin might cause, creating guilt and anxiety that he carries throughout the episode. He works to try to save the assassin and prevent the harm, putting himself in danger to fix the situation. A psychologist would observe that Morty is carrying forward emotional burden from this situation, even as he is simultaneously dealing with the immediate dangers and challenges of the adventure. The psychological strain from feeling responsible for potential deaths adds to whatever strain he is already carrying from previous adventures, and this accumulated strain affects how he experiences and responds to the current situation. The episode The Ricks Must Be Crazy from Season 2 demonstrates how psychological strain affects Morty's capacity to handle additional stress. In this episode, Rick's car battery stops working, and they discover that Rick created an entire miniature universe to power his car battery. The beings in that universe created their own miniature universe, and so on. Throughout the episode, Morty is dealing with the philosophical and ethical implications of what Rick has done, creating existential strain as he tries to understand the morality of Rick's actions. At the same time, he is in physical danger as the situation becomes violent. A psychologist would note that Morty is trying to process complex ethical questions while simultaneously managing fear and danger, showing how multiple sources of psychological strain can operate simultaneously and compound each other. His ability to think clearly about the ethics is impaired by the fear and danger, while his ability to manage the danger is impaired by the psychological distress from understanding what Rick has done. The episode Interdimensional Cable 2, Tempting Fate from Season 2 shows psychological strain from a different source. Jerry needs an operation that might kill him, and the family must decide whether to approve it. Morty experiences strain from worry about Jerry dying, from guilt about sometimes wishing Jerry was not around, and from the general family tension during this crisis. A psychologist would observe that not all psychological strain comes from adventures with Rick. Family stress, worry about loved ones, and normal life challenges also create strain that adds to the burden Morty is carrying from his adventures. The cumulative effect of all these sources of strain means that Morty is constantly operating under psychological pressure without significant relief or recovery periods. The episode Big Trouble in Little Sanchez from Season 2 shows how psychological strain affects Morty's daily functioning at school. Rick transfers his consciousness into a teenage clone body and attends high school with Morty and Summer. During this episode, Morty is dealing with normal high school stress about grades, social relationships, and his crush on Jessica, while simultaneously managing the unusual situation of having Rick at school causing chaos. A psychologist would note that Morty is trying to maintain normal teenage functioning and concerns while carrying the psychological burden from his adventures with Rick. The strain from his adventures does not go away when he is at school. It remains present, affecting his ability to focus on schoolwork, to enjoy social interactions, and to experience normal teenage development without the additional weight of accumulated trauma and stress. The episode The Wedding Squanchers from Season 2 shows extreme psychological strain during a crisis. After the wedding massacre and Rick turning himself in, Morty and his family must deal with Earth being taken over by the Federation. Morty experiences strain from multiple sources simultaneously, including fear about Rick's fate, grief about losing his grandfather, stress from living under occupation, and the general disruption of his entire life and world. A psychologist would observe that during this period, Morty's psychological strain reaches extremely high levels as multiple major stressors converge at once. His capacity to cope is being tested beyond normal limits as he tries to manage all these sources of strain without adequate support or resources. The episode Rick Mancing the Stone from Season 4 shows Morty dealing with psychological strain from his parents' divorce. In this episode, Beth and Jerry have separated, and Morty is coping with this family disruption while also going on dangerous adventures in a post-apocalyptic world. A psychologist would note that Morty is using adventures as a form of escape or avoidance of the painful family situation, which means he is not processing the strain from the divorce in healthy ways. Instead, he is adding more strain from dangerous adventures on top of the existing strain from family disruption, creating a pattern where strain continuously accumulates without being addressed or resolved. The episode Vindicators 3: The Return of Worldender from Season 3 demonstrates how psychological strain affects Morty's relationships with others. In this episode, Morty joins Rick on a mission with a superhero team called the Vindicators. Morty admires these heroes and wants their approval, but Rick's behavior embarrasses and undermines Morty throughout the mission. A psychologist would observe that Morty experiences psychological strain from feeling caught between his admiration for the Vindicators and his loyalty to Rick, from embarrassment about Rick's actions, and from the disappointment of seeing his heroes behave in less than heroic ways. This social and relational strain adds to his accumulated burden of stress. The episode The Rick Lantis Mix-Up from Season 3, while not directly focused on our Morty, illustrates the universal psychological strain that exists for Mortys across dimensions. The episode shows Mortys working in factories, serving as police officers, and living in various conditions within the Citadel. Many of these Mortys appear worn down, exhausted, and resigned to difficult lives. A psychologist would observe that these Mortys display signs of chronic psychological strain that has worn away their emotional resilience and energy over time. While this is not our specific Morty, seeing this pattern across many Mortys suggests that constant strain is inherent to the experiences Mortys face. The episode The ABCs of Beth from Season 3 shows Morty dealing with strain from family dysfunction and his mother's psychological problems. Beth is confronting her own trauma and her relationship with Rick, and this creates tension and instability in the household that Morty must navigate. A psychologist would note that children experience psychological strain when their parents are struggling, or when the family environment is unstable and unpredictable. Morty cannot rely on his home environment as a source of stability and recovery, because the home itself is a source of ongoing strain. The episode Rattlestar Ricklactica from Season 4 shows psychological strain from dealing with the consequences of mistakes. Morty accidentally kills a snake astronaut, leading to a cascade of problems involving time-traveling snakes. Throughout the episode, Morty experiences strain from guilt about causing the initial problem, fear about the escalating situation, and stress from trying to fix what he broke. A psychologist would observe that this pattern where Morty's actions or mistakes lead to escalating consequences that he must then manage creates a particular type of psychological strain related to responsibility, guilt, and the pressure to fix problems. The episode Never Ricking Morty from Season 4, while being meta and experimental, shows how even the structure and nature of storytelling create strain for Morty. The episode plays with narrative conventions and traps Morty in a story train where he must navigate through different types of stories. A psychologist would note that the meta-commentary here reflects how Morty is trapped in cycles of adventure and strain without escape, highlighting how the constant nature of his experiences creates ongoing psychological pressure. The episode Primordius from Season 4 shows psychological strain from identity confusion and manipulation. Morty and Rick are taken over by facehugger-like parasites that use their bodies to build a civilization. When they break free, Morty experiences strain from the violation of having his body used without his consent, and from the confusion about what happened while he was not in control. A psychologist would observe that experiences where your autonomy and bodily control are violated create particular types of psychological strain related to safety, trust, and sense of self. The episode Star Mort Rickturn of the Jerry from Season 4 shows psychological strain during revelations about family secrets and during battles with galactic forces. Morty learns about clones of Beth and must process this information while dealing with immediate danger. A psychologist would note that having to process significant emotional information while under physical threat creates intense psychological strain, because the mind cannot fully attend to either the emotional processing or the danger management, creating divided attention and overwhelming demand on psychological resources. The episode Mort Dinner Rick Andre from Season 5 shows chronic low-level strain from Rick's manipulation and from managing family relationships. Rick creates time distortions to avoid family dinner, while Morty tries to maintain some form of normal family functioning. A psychologist would observe that the constant need to manage Rick's behavior, to try to maintain normalcy, and to deal with Rick's deceptions creates ongoing strain even during periods without major crises or adventures. This chronic low-level strain may be less dramatic than major traumatic events, yet it contributes significantly to accumulated psychological burden because it never stops. The episode Forgetting Sarek Mortshall from Season 5 shows strain from memory manipulation and uncertainty about what experiences are real. A psychologist would observe that when you cannot trust your own memories or know for certain what experiences you actually had, this creates profound psychological strain because memory is fundamental to identity and to making sense of your life. The strain from uncertainty about reality itself adds another layer to Morty's accumulated burden. A psychologist observing Morty across all these episodes would note that his psychological strain is not just about the individual traumatic events themselves. It is about the relentless, constant nature of stress and challenge without adequate recovery periods. It is about how strain from multiple sources compounds and accumulates. It is about how Morty must try to maintain normal functioning in school and family life while carrying a burden of unprocessed experiences and unresolved stress. It is about how each new source of strain adds to existing strain rather than replacing it, creating a growing psychological weight that becomes increasingly difficult to manage. The persistence of this strain over time, across seasons, without significant relief or resolution, creates conditions where Morty's psychological functioning cannot help but be affected in observable ways. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. This relentless accumulation of psychological strain eventually manifests in changes to how Morty responds emotionally to disturbing events, with his reactions becoming noticeably different from his earlier baseline responses. Section 4. Emotional blunting and detachment. A psychologist observing Morty across the series would note that as he continues experiencing adventures and accumulating trauma exposure, he sometimes appears less emotionally reactive to disturbing events compared to his responses in earlier seasons. This change in emotional reactivity is what psychologists call emotional blunting or emotional numbing, which is a recognized response to chronic stress and trauma in psychological research and clinical practice. When someone experiences repeated trauma without time to process and recover, their emotional system can begin to shut down or dampen responses as a protective mechanism that operates automatically below conscious awareness. The idea is that if every traumatic event produces full emotional intensity every single time, the person would be constantly overwhelmed and unable to function in their daily life. So the mind adapts by reducing the emotional intensity of responses, creating a kind of numbness or detachment that allows the person to continue functioning even as disturbing things happen around them. This emotional blunting is not a conscious choice that the person makes deliberately. It is an automatic adaptation that happens below awareness as the psychological system tries to protect itself from being completely overwhelmed by constant emotional intensity. The episode Anatomy Park from Season 1, which was discussed earlier as part of Morty's baseline emotional profile, provides a reference point for his early emotional responses to death and harm. In this episode, when people die during the adventure inside the homeless man's body, Morty reacts with visible distress and guilt that shows clearly on his face and in his behavior. His emotional response is immediate and clearly affects him in ways that he cannot hide or suppress. A psychologist would note this as his baseline emotional reactivity to death and harm during the early seasons. He feels it acutely and shows that feeling through his behavior, expressions, and words. This baseline helps us understand what changes as the series progresses and as Morty accumulates more traumatic experiences. The episode Rest and Relaxation from Season 3 provides important insight into emotional numbing through the spa treatment that removes negative emotions and trauma from Rick and Morty temporarily. When Morty's negative emotions are removed through this process, he becomes more confident and successful in conventional ways, able to function without the weight of fear, guilt, and anxiety that normally constrain his behavior. However, he also loses important aspects of his personality, including appropriate caution about danger and moral concern about right and wrong. The episode shows that emotions, even difficult and painful ones, serve important functions in guiding behavior and maintaining values and ethical boundaries. When those emotions are removed, Morty can act without the normal emotional feedback that would tell him something is wrong or dangerous or morally questionable. A psychologist would observe that this artificial emotional blunting, while created through technology rather than through trauma, demonstrates what happens when emotional responses are dampened or removed from someone's psychological functioning. The person can function in some ways and may even appear more successful in certain domains. Yet, they lose important information and guidance that emotions normally provide about safety, relationships, and moral boundaries. The episode The Whirly-Durly Conspiracy from Season 3 shows Morty in a situation where he could potentially kill Jerry if he wanted to, and he goes through complex emotional processing about his relationship with his stepfather and whether Jerry's death would make things better. However, a psychologist would note that the fact that Morty seriously contemplates killing Jerry, even temporarily before deciding against it, shows a significant shift from his earlier baseline, where such thoughts would have been unthinkable and would have caused immediate moral horror. His emotions around violence and harm have shifted to the point where he can seriously consider actions that earlier Morty would have rejected immediately, without any contemplation or consideration. This suggests some blunting of his emotional response to the idea of causing death, where the emotional barrier that would have prevented such thoughts has been weakened or reduced through repeated exposure to violence and death. The episode The Rickturian Morty Date from Season 3 shows Morty confronting the President of the United States and engaging in direct conflict with one of the most powerful people in the world without the level of fear and anxiety he would have, shown in earlier seasons when facing authority figures or dangerous situations. While this could be interpreted as healthy confidence or natural growth and maturation as Morty gets older, a psychologist might also observe elements of emotional blunting, where Morty's fear response has been dampened through repeated exposure to danger and threat. He is less afraid than he used to be, which allows him to act more boldly and to stand up for himself in ways that earlier Morty could not. Yet this reduced fear may also represent adaptation to constant threat, where his emotional system has recalibrated what counts as dangerous, making situations that should trigger fear responses fail to activate those responses at normal intensity. The episode Edge of Tomorty Rick Die Rick Pete from Season 4 shows Morty dealing with Rick's repeated deaths with less emotional reaction than we might expect, given how much Rick means to him. Each time Rick dies in this episode, Morty shows some distress and concern. Yet, he also shows a growing acceptance and reduced intensity of grief response as the deaths continue and accumulate. A psychologist would observe that this pattern, where repeated exposure to the same type of traumatic event leads to progressively reduced emotional response, is a clear example of emotional blunting in action. The first death produces more emotional impact than the fifth death, and the fifth produces more impact than the 10th. Not because the deaths matter less, or because Morty cares less about Rick, but because Morty's emotional system has adapted, reducing its response intensity to a stimulus that keeps repeating. The episode One Crew Over the Crew-Coo's Morty from Season 4 involves Morty participating in an elaborate heist without showing the level of anxiety and moral concern that earlier Morty would have displayed when engaging in criminal activity. Or deception. He has adapted to these types of situations through repeated exposure, and his emotional responses have become more muted and controlled. A psychologist would note that this represents successful adaptation, in the sense that Morty can function during adventures without being paralyzed by fear or overwhelmed by anxiety. Yet it also represents loss of emotional sensitivity that earlier guided his moral decision-making and self-protection instincts. The episode Childrick of Mort from Season 4 shows Morty dealing with the possibility that Rick has fathered children that he then abandoned, which would be a significant moral failing. Morty's reaction to this morally troubling information is relatively mild compared to how intensely he reacted to moral issues and ethical violations in earlier seasons, when his moral emotions were more active. A psychologist would observe that Morty's moral emotions, including outrage, disappointment, and judgment, have become somewhat blunted, allowing him to encounter information about Rick's potential abandonment of children without the level of distress and moral outrage that might have characterized earlier Morty's response to learning about such behavior. The episode Star Mort Rickturn of the Jerry from Season 4 involves intense space battles and life-threatening danger, and Morty handles these situations with relative calm and composure compared to his early panic responses to danger in the pilot and first season episodes. A psychologist would note that while some of this represents learned coping skills and healthy adaptation to stress, it also represents emotional numbing, where fear responses have been reduced through repeated exposure to life-threatening situations. Morty has become somewhat desensitized to danger through constant exposure, which means situations that should trigger strong fear responses now trigger only moderate responses. The episode Mort Dinner Rick Andre from Season 5 shows Morty dealing with Rick's lies and manipulations about the time bubbles with a kind of weary acceptance rather than the hurt and betrayal that earlier Morty might have felt more intensely when discovering Rick had deceived him. A psychologist would observe that Morty's emotional response to being deceived and manipulated has become blunted through repeated experiences of this pattern over multiple seasons. He expects deception from Rick now, and his emotional system has adapted by reducing the intensity of emotional response to what has become a familiar pattern of behavior that he encounters regularly. The episode Rick Dependent Spray from Season 5 involves extremely embarrassing circumstances around Morty's sperm becoming giant monsters, creating public humiliation on a massive scale. Yet Morty handles this public humiliation with more emotional control and less visible shame than earlier Morty might have managed when facing embarrassment. While some of this could be maturation and better emotional regulation skills developed through adolescence, a psychologist might also observe elements of emotional numbing, where shame and embarrassment responses have been somewhat dampened through repeated exposure to emotionally difficult and humiliating situations. The episode Forgetting Sarek Mortshall from Season 5 shows Morty discovering that memories have been erased and manipulated without his knowledge or consent, and he reacts with less distress than we might expect given the violation this represents. A psychologist would note that Morty's response to discovering manipulation of his memories and reality is relatively muted, suggesting some emotional blunting around trust violations and reality manipulation that have become familiar experiences for him through repeated exposure. A psychologist would also note that emotional blunting can serve protective functions, while simultaneously creating other problems in different areas of functioning. On one hand, reduced emotional intensity allows Morty to function during adventures without being constantly overwhelmed by fear, anxiety, or distress. He can think more clearly during danger because he is less paralyzed by fear.
He can make decisions and take action without being flooded by anxiety that would prevent effective functioning.
This adaptation has genuine survival value in the dangerous situations Morty regularly encounters on adventures with Rick. On the other hand, emotional blunting can lead to significant problems, including reduced ability to recognize danger signals that emotions normally provide, reduced motivation to avoid harmful situations because fear is not providing appropriate warning signals, difficulty connecting with others emotionally because emotional responses are dampened, and loss of emotional depth and richness in experience that makes life feel meaningful and vivid. When emotions become blunted, life can start to feel flat or empty, and the person may have difficulty knowing what they feel or caring deeply about things that used to matter to them. The show does not present Morty's emotional changes as simple numbing or complete detachment from all feeling. Instead, it shows a complex pattern where Morty still experiences emotions across a range of types, yet those emotions are often less intense or less prominent than his earlier baseline responses would predict, based on how he reacted in Season 1. He can still feel fear, sadness, guilt, anger, and other emotions in various situations, yet the threshold for triggering those emotions has shifted upward, and their intensity when triggered has decreased compared to his baseline. A psychologist would recognize this pattern as partial emotional blunting rather than complete emotional shutdown, which is common in trauma responses where the person retains emotional capacity but with altered patterns of emotional experience that affect how they respond to situation. It is also important to note that emotional blunting is not consistent across all situations or all types of emotions in Morty's case. Morty may show reduced fear responses in some dangerous situations, while still showing strong emotional reactions in other contexts, particularly in relation to specific people like Jessica, or specific types of situations that still manage to break through his emotional numbing. A psychologist would observe that selective emotional blunting is common, where certain emotions or certain triggers show more numbing while others remain relatively intact, creating an uneven pattern of emotional responsiveness. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. While emotional blunting represents one significant change in how Morty responds to his experiences, it exists alongside other trauma-related patterns, including his own explicit recognition and statement of having PTSD. Section 5. Explicit PTSD Declaration in Summer of All Fears. A psychologist observing Morty across the series would find it significant and unusual when a character explicitly names their own psychological condition. And this is exactly what happens in Season 8, Episode 1, titled Summer of All Fears. In this episode, Morty makes a direct statement about having PTSD, saying explicitly, "I had PTSD," during a scene where he is visibly traumatized and struggling with the psychological aftermath of his experiences. This explicit self-reporting is rare for animated characters and represents a clear narrative signal from the show that trauma is central to Morty's internal experience and psychological state. Most of the time in television and film, trauma is shown through behavior and symptoms, without characters directly naming or identifying their condition. When a character does explicitly name their psychological state, it represents a significant moment of self-awareness and acknowledgement that should not be overlooked or dismissed as simply a throwaway line or a joke. PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a psychological condition that can develop after someone experiences or witnesses a traumatic event or series of traumatic events. The condition involves specific symptoms, including re-experiencing the trauma through flashbacks or nightmares, avoiding reminders of the trauma, negative changes in thoughts and mood, and changes in physical and emotional reactions, including being easily startled or feeling constantly on guard. A psychologist would explain that PTSD is not simply feeling upset or sad about something bad that happened. It is a specific pattern of symptoms that persist over time and interfere with the person's ability to function in daily life. The fact that Morty uses this specific clinical term suggests he has some understanding of what PTSD is and recognizes that his symptoms match this condition. Less time passed in the real world. During this time in the simulation, Morty experienced prolonged violence, participated in warlike conditions, and lived through scenarios that would be traumatic for any person, but especially for a teenager who is still developing psychologically. A psychologist would recognize that time spent in a simulated reality where you experience real psychological and emotional responses to events, even if those events are not physically real, can create genuine trauma because the brain processes the experiences as real during the time they are happening. The fear, pain, stress, and horror that Morty felt during this simulation were real emotions and real psychological experiences, even if the physical events triggering them were simulated. When Morty emerges from this simulation and returns to normal reality, he is carrying the psychological weight of years of traumatic experiences compressed into whatever actual time passed in the real world. His mind has memories of extended periods of violence and survival that his body did not physically experience, creating a disconnect between his psychological age and his physical age. A psychologist would observe that this creates unique challenges for processing and integrating the experience because Morty's support system and environment do not recognize or validate the length and intensity of what he went through. To everyone else, he was gone for a relatively short time. To Morty, he lived through years of trauma. In the episode, Morty experiences flashbacks to violent scenes from his time in the simulation. Flashbacks are a hallmark symptom of PTSD, where the person suddenly and involuntarily re-experiences traumatic events as if they are happening in the present moment rather than being safely in the past. During a flashback, the person may see images from the traumatic event, hear sounds, smell smells, or feel physical sensations associated with the trauma. The experience feels real and immediate rather than like a memory. A psychologist would note that flashbacks are different from regular memories because they involve a sense of reliving the event rather than remembering it from a distance. And they often come with the same emotional and physical responses that occurred during the original traumatic event. Morty's flashbacks in this episode are triggered by specific stimuli in his current environment that remind him of the traumatic experiences in the simulation. This is how trauma triggers work psychologically. The brain creates associations between the traumatic event and various sensory details that were present during the trauma, such as sights, sounds, smells, or situations. Later, when the person encounters similar sensory details in a safe context, their brain automatically activates the fear and stress response associated with the original trauma, even though there is no actual danger in the present moment. The person may experience intense fear, panic, physical symptoms like rapid heartbeat and sweating, and flashbacks to the traumatic event. All because something in their current environment reminded their brain of the trauma. A psychologist would observe that Morty's explicit statement, "I had PTSD," represents significant self-awareness about his psychological state. He is not just experiencing symptoms without understanding what is happening to him. He has recognized those symptoms as belonging to a specific pattern that has a name and that represents a psychological condition. This level of self-awareness suggests that Morty has either learned about PTSD through some source of information, perhaps at school or through media, or has recognized his symptoms as matching descriptions of trauma responses he has encountered. The fact that he uses past tense "I had PTSD" rather than present tense "I have PTSD" is also psychologically interesting, potentially suggesting either that he believes he has recovered from the PTSD, that the worst symptoms have passed, or that he is using past tense to create distance from the painful reality of currently struggling with trauma symptoms. The episode shows Morty visibly struggling with the psychological aftermath of his experiences in the simulation. He is not functioning normally or maintaining his usual level of coping. He is showing clear signs of distress and difficulty managing his emotions and reactions. A psychologist would note that the combination of explicit self-reporting of PTSD with visible symptoms and functional impairment provides strong evidence that Morty is experiencing clinically significant trauma responses that are affecting his ability to function in daily life. The prolonged nature of the trauma Morty experienced in the simulation is particularly significant psychologically. Short-term acute trauma,
while serious, is often easier to process and recover from than prolonged chronic trauma that extends over months or years.
When someone experiences trauma repeatedly over an extended period, the psychological impact tends to be more severe and more complex because the person's entire sense of self, their worldview, and their basic assumptions about safety and reality become affected. Morty did not just experience a single traumatic event in the simulation. He experienced what felt like years of ongoing trauma, which would create deep and pervasive changes to his psychology. A psychologist would also note that trauma experienced during adolescence can be particularly impactful because the brain is still developing during this period and because adolescence is a critical time for identity formation and psychological development. Experiences during adolescence shape who the person becomes as an adult in fundamental ways. Morty experienced what felt like years of war and violence during his teenage years, which means this trauma occurred during a critical developmental period when his brain and personality were still forming. The warlike conditions that Morty experienced in the simulation would expose him to multiple types of trauma simultaneously. Combat trauma typically involves direct threats to life, witnessing death and injury, participating in violence, making life and death decisions under extreme stress, loss of comrades, moral injury from actions taken during combat that violate personal values, and chronic fear and hypervigilance. All of these elements create complex trauma that affects multiple domains of psychological functioning, including emotional regulation, relationships, sense of identity, worldview, and basic sense of safety. The episode's explicit acknowledgement of Morty having PTSD represents the show making a clear statement that Morty's psychological struggles are not just background characterization or minor personality quirks. They are significant psychological conditions that affect his life and functioning in serious ways. A psychologist would observe that by having Morty explicitly name his PTSD, the show is validating Morty's psychological experience and acknowledging that what he has been through across multiple seasons has created real psychological consequences. This explicit acknowledgement also provides context for understanding Morty's behavior patterns across earlier seasons. Looking back at previous episodes with the knowledge that Morty develops PTSD, we can recognize earlier signs and symptoms that were building toward this explicit recognition. The emotional numbing discussed in the previous section, the changes in how Morty responds to danger and violence, his relationship difficulties, his struggles with anxiety and fear, all of these can be understood as trauma responses that were accumulating and intensifying over time until reaching the point where Morty himself recognizes and names his condition. A psychologist would also consider how Morty's PTSD declaration might affect his future functioning and his relationships with others. Having explicitly recognized that he has PTSD might motivate Morty to seek help or to make changes in his life to address his trauma. Alternatively, naming the condition might not lead to any changes if Morty does not have access to treatment or support, or if he feels unable to escape the ongoing traumatic situation of continuing to go on adventures with Rick. The fact that Morty says, "I had PTSD," to others in the episode, presumably to Summer or other family members based on the episode title focusing on Summer, suggests that he is communicating his psychological state to people close to him. A psychologist would note that disclosure of trauma and trauma symptoms to others is an important step that can either lead to increased support and understanding or to dismissal and invalidation depending on how others respond. The response that Morty receives when he discloses his PTSD will significantly affect his recovery and his willingness to be open about his psychological struggles in the future. The episode Summer of All Fears represents a turning point in how the show addresses Morty's trauma. Earlier seasons showed trauma symptoms through behavior and emotional responses without explicitly naming them. This episode makes the implicit explicit by having Morty directly state that he has PTSD. A psychologist would observe that this shift from implicit to explicit recognition of trauma is significant both for Morty's character development and for the show's treatment of psychological themes. The simulation experience that led to Morty's PTSD declaration also raises interesting questions about the nature of trauma and what counts as a real traumatic experience. If someone experiences intense fear, violence, and suffering in a simulation that feels completely real during the experience, does that create real trauma, even though the events were not physically real?
Psychologists would generally say yes, because trauma is fundamentally about psychological experience rather than physical events.
The brain processes simulated experiences as real if the simulation is convincing enough, which means the psychological and emotional responses are genuine even if the physical events are not. This has implications for understanding all of Morty's adventures with Rick. While the adventures are physically real rather than simulated, there is still a sense in which Morty's psychological experience during adventures may be more intense or different than an outside observer might recognize. The subjective experience of terror, helplessness, horror, and traumatic stress is what creates psychological trauma. And Morty's subjective experience across hundreds of adventures has clearly been traumatic enough to create PTSD symptoms that he himself recognizes and names. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. This self-recognition of trauma deepens when we examine how PTSD shows up behaviorally through flashbacks and reactions to trauma triggers that appear across multiple episodes. Section 6. Flashbacks and Trauma Triggers. A psychologist observing Morty after his experiences in the Matrix simulation and his explicit declaration of having PTSD would pay close attention to how trauma manifests in his ongoing behavior through
Flashbacks and reactions to trauma triggers.
Flashbacks and triggers are two of the most characteristic symptoms of PTSD and trauma responses, and understanding how they work psychologically helps us recognize when they are occurring in Morty's behavior across different episodes. A flashback is an involuntary, intrusive memory where the person suddenly feels as if they are re-experiencing a traumatic event in the present moment, rather than safely remembering something from the past. Triggers are stimuli in the current environment that activate trauma responses because they remind the brain of something associated with the original traumatic experience. The Matrix simulation that Morty experienced in Summer of All Fears created conditions that psychologists recognize as extremely likely to produce flashbacks and trigger responses. When someone experiences prolonged trauma in warlike conditions, their brain forms strong associations between various environmental cues and the danger and horror they experienced. These associations are not formed consciously or deliberately through active thinking. They are automatic processes that occur in the parts of the brain responsible for survival and threat detection, particularly the amygdala, which processes fear and emotional memories. However, this protective mechanism becomes problematic when it continues activating even in safe situations that only resemble the traumatic situation in superficial ways. Morty's flashbacks to violent scenes from the simulation, as shown in the episode, demonstrate how trauma memories are stored and retrieved differently than normal memories in the brain. Normal memories are typically experienced as memories, with the person knowing they are remembering something from the past and maintaining awareness that they are currently safe in the present. Traumatic memories, especially when they emerge as flashbacks, are experienced as if the event is happening now, in the present moment. The person may see the images, hear the sounds, feel the emotions, and experience the physical sensations associated with the trauma while losing awareness that they are actually safe in the present moment. This is what makes flashbacks so distressing and frightening, because during the flashback, the person genuinely believes the trauma is occurring again, and they are in danger. A psychologist would note that flashbacks can be triggered by specific reminders of the trauma, or can occur spontaneously without any obvious trigger that the person can identify. When Morty encounters something in his current environment that reminds his brain of the Matrix simulation, or of other traumatic adventures, his brain may automatically activate the fear and survival response that was active during the original trauma. This happens because the brain has created strong neural pathways connecting certain sensory experiences with danger and threat. When the brain detects something similar to what was present during trauma, it immediately activates the alarm system to prepare the person to fight, flee, or freeze, even if there is no actual danger in the present moment. The warlike conditions that Morty experienced in the simulation would create numerous potential triggers across different sensory modalities. The sound of loud noises might trigger memories of explosions or weapons fire. The sight of certain landscapes or environments might trigger memories of battlefields or combat zones. The presence of conflict or aggression in social situations might trigger memories of combat. The feeling of being trapped or unable to escape might trigger memories of helplessness during the simulation. A psychologist would observe that someone who experienced prolonged war trauma would likely have many different triggers because war involves so many different types of traumatic experiences occurring in various contexts with different sensory details. Morty's experience with triggers is not limited to the Matrix simulation trauma. Across the series, spanning 8 seasons, Morty has experienced numerous different types of trauma on his adventures with Rick, and each traumatic experience creates its own set of potential triggers. The episode Rick Potion number 9 inches, where Morty had to bury his own body, might create triggers around graves, death, funerals, or questions about identity and reality. Make decisions about who to trust. The episode Look Who's Purging Now, where Morty participated in large-scale violence, might create triggers around crowds, aggression, situations where rules and social order break down, or even just the color red from all the blood. A psychologist would recognize that when someone has experienced multiple different traumas across different situations and contexts, they can develop a complex web of triggers where many different stimuli can activate trauma responses. This means the person may find it difficult to go through daily life without encountering triggers, because so many different things remind their brain of various traumatic experiences. For Morty, this could mean that school, family interactions, social situations with peers, and even mundane activities like watching television or eating dinner might unexpectedly trigger trauma responses because something about the current situation resembles something from one of his many traumatic adventures. The episode The Vat of Acid episode from Season 4 provides an example of how Morty might experience triggers related to trust and betrayal. In this episode, Rick manipulates Morty's reality using the save point device, leading Morty to believe he has lived a full life and developed a meaningful relationship with a girl, only to discover it was all controlled by Rick and none of it was real from the other person's perspective. A psychologist would observe that this experience of profound betrayal and reality manipulation could create triggers around trusting others, around whether experiences are real and meaningful, and around Rick's behavior specifically. Situations where Morty feels uncertain about what is real or where he feels like he might be being manipulated could trigger anxiety, distress, and flashbacks to discovering the save point deception. Sometimes triggers produce subtler responses, like increased anxiety, irritability, avoidance behavior, or physical symptoms like muscle tension, rapid heartbeat, or difficulty breathing. Morty might encounter a trigger and experience a surge of fear or discomfort without understanding why he suddenly feels unsafe, because triggers often activate responses before conscious awareness catches up to explain what is happening. A psychologist would note that this is because the brain's threat detection system operates much faster than conscious thinking, activating the fear response in milliseconds before the conscious mind even recognizes what triggered the response. The episode Morty Night Run from Season 2, while not primarily about trauma, shows Morty dealing with guilt and responsibility about potentially causing harm when he helps an assassin escape. If Morty experienced trauma related to feeling responsible for negative outcomes, situations where he has to make decisions with uncertain consequences might serve as triggers that activate anxiety and distress associated with past experiences of guilt. A psychologist would observe that moral trauma, where someone feels they violated their own values or caused harm to others, creates its own category of triggers related to ethical decision-making and situations that activate feelings of guilt, shame. Trauma triggers can also be internal rather than external. Thoughts, emotions, memories, or physical sensations can trigger trauma responses just as external environmental cues can. If Morty starts to feel a certain emotion that he strongly felt during a traumatic experience, that emotion itself might trigger memories and responses associated with the trauma. If he has a thought that reminds him of something from a traumatic event,
that thought might spiral into a flashback or panic response. A psychologist would note that internal triggers can be particularly difficult to manage because the person cannot avoid their own thoughts and feelings the way they might avoid external reminders of trauma. The episode Pickle Rick from Season 3 shows Rick avoiding family therapy through extreme means. And while the episode focuses on Rick's avoidance, a psychologist might also consider how Morty responds to the idea of therapy and emotional vulnerability. If Morty has had experiences where talking about difficult topics led to negative consequences, or where vulnerability was punished or dismissed, the idea of therapy itself might serve as a trigger that activates avoidance and anxiety. This would make it difficult for Morty to seek help for his trauma, even when he recognizes he needs it. A psychologist would also observe that repeated exposure to triggers without proper processing and treatment can make trauma symptoms worse over time rather than better. Each time a trigger activates a trauma response and that response is not properly processed, validated, and resolved, it can strengthen the neural pathways connecting the trigger to the trauma response, making future responses more likely and more intense. This creates a cycle where triggers become more sensitive and more numerous over time, expanding the range of situations that activate trauma responses. Morty's ongoing adventures with Rick create a situation where he continues to be exposed to potentially traumatic events, even as he is trying to cope with trauma from past events. This means he may experience new traumatic events that create new triggers, while simultaneously dealing with existing triggers from past trauma. A psychologist would recognize this as an extremely challenging situation psychologically, because recovery from trauma typically requires a period of safety where the person is not experiencing new trauma while they process and heal from past trauma. Morty does not get this period of safety, which means his trauma symptoms are likely to persist and potentially worsen rather than improving naturally over time. The episode Rest and Ricklaxation from Season 3 shows Morty seeking treatment for his accumulated stress and trauma through the spa's detox process. A psychologist would observe that Morty's choice to seek this treatment suggests awareness that he is struggling and needs help, even if the specific treatment method is not realistic or evidence-based. The fact that removing Morty's negative emotions changes his personality so dramatically demonstrates how much those emotions, and the experiences that created them, have become central to who Morty is psychologically. Understanding Morty's flashbacks and triggers helps us recognize that trauma is not just about the original traumatic event. Trauma creates ongoing psychological effects that persist long after the event itself is over, affecting how the person experiences and navigates their daily life. Every time Morty encounters a trigger, he is dealing with his trauma again, even if he is currently safe and no new traumatic event is occurring. A psychologist would observe that this is part of what makes PTSD so challenging to live with, because the trauma keeps intruding into the present through flashbacks and trigger responses, preventing the person from feeling fully safe and present in their current life. The accumulation of triggers across multiple different traumas also means that Morty's world has become increasingly filled with potential reminders of trauma. What might seem like ordinary situations to others could be landmines of triggers for Morty, activating memories and responses that others cannot see or understand. A psychologist would note that this creates a sense of isolation, where Morty's internal experience is very different from what others perceive, making it difficult for others to understand what he is going through or to provide appropriate support. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Trauma triggers also influence his sense of identity and how Morty understands who he is in relation to his experiences and his family. Section 7. Identity Strain and Sense of Self. A psychologist observing Morty across the series would note that his repeated traumatic experiences do not just affect his emotional responses and create symptoms like flashbacks and triggers. They also affect something more fundamental, which is his sense of identity and his understanding of who he is as a person. Identity is the collection of beliefs, values, experiences, and characteristics that make up our sense of self, our answer to the question, who am I? For adolescents like Morty, identity is still actively forming and developing, which means trauma during adolescence can disrupt healthy identity development and create what psychologists call identity strain, where the person struggles to maintain a coherent and positive sense of who they are. The episode Me Seeks and Destroy from Season 1 shows early signs of Morty's struggles with self-worth and competence.
In this episode, Morty insists on choosing an adventure to prove that he can have good ideas and make good decisions. The fact that Morty feels the need to prove this suggests he already doubts his own capabilities and worth. When the adventure goes badly, Morty's worst fears about himself are confirmed in his mind, reinforcing his sense of inadequacy. A psychologist would observe that this pattern where Morty tries to prove himself, fails, and then feels worse about himself creates a cycle that damages his developing sense of competence and self-worth. The constant comparison with Rick creates additional strain on Morty's identity. Rick is presented as the smartest person in the universe, supremely confident, capable of solving almost any problem through intelligence and technology. Morty is positioned as the opposite, frequently called stupid by Rick, making mistakes, and needing Rick to solve problems for him. A psychologist would note that developing your identity in the shadow of someone so overwhelming and critical would be extremely difficult, especially when that person is a family member who you spend enormous amounts of time with and whose approval you desire. The episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind from Season 1 provides important context for understanding Morty's identity struggles. In this episode, we see the Citadel of Ricks, where infinite versions of Rick from different dimensions have created a society. We also see that Mortys are treated as commodities or accessories to Ricks, rather than as people with their own value and agency. A psychologist would observe that discovering you are one of infinite interchangeable versions of yourself across dimensions, and that those versions are generally treated as lesser and expendable, would create profound questions about identity and worth. If there are infinite Mortys, and they are all considered disposable, what makes our Morty special or valuable? The episode The Ricklantis Mix-Up from Season 3 deepens this exploration of Morty identity across dimension. The episode shows various Mortys living different lives in the Citadel, some working in factories, some as police officers, some in other roles. The variety of Morty experiences raises questions about whether being Morty determines who you become, or whether Mortys have the capacity to develop different identities based on their experiences. A psychologist would note that for our Morty watching or learning about other Mortys in different circumstances, this could create confusion about which aspects of his identity are truly him versus which aspects are just products of his particular situation with his particular Rick. Morty's experiences of trauma contribute to identity strain in several specific ways. First, trauma can create a sense of being fundamentally changed or damaged. When someone goes through traumatic experiences, they may feel like they are no longer the same person they were before, that something essential has been broken or lost. The episode Rick Potion number 9 inches demonstrates this literally when Morty has to leave his original dimension and take the place of an alternate Morty who died. A psychologist would observe that having to literally assume a different version of yourself's life while carrying memories that no one else shares would create profound identity confusion about which Morty he really is. Second, trauma can create identity confusion around questions of capability and agency. Morty has been forced to do things he never would have chosen, to participate in violence he finds morally wrong, and to endure situations he could not control or escape. A psychologist would note that repeated experiences of helplessness and forced participation in traumatic events can damage a person's sense of agency, which is the feeling that you have control over your own actions and life. When you repeatedly experience situations where your choices don't matter, or where you are forced to act against your will, it becomes difficult to maintain a sense of yourself as an active agent who makes meaningful choices. The episode Look Who's Purging Now from Season 2 illustrates this identity confusion around violence and morality. Morty gets caught up in the purge violence and participates in killing despite his baseline personality being empathetic and opposed to violence. Afterward, Morty has to integrate this experience of himself as someone who killed people, someone who got caught up in violence, into his understanding of who he is. A psychologist would observe that when your actions during extreme circumstances contradict your values and your normal sense of self, it creates identity strain as you try to reconcile these conflicting aspects of your experience. Third, trauma affects identity through changes in how you see yourself and your future. Morty has experienced numerous near-death experiences and has witnessed the meaninglessness and fragility of life across infinite dimensions. A psychologist would note that these experiences might affect Morty's sense of his own future, his belief that his life has meaning or purpose. and his ability to imagine himself having a normal life.
The episode 60 Minutes from Season 1 shows an alternate version of Morty's parents living different lives without him, suggesting that his existence is not necessary or central even to his own family's potential happiness.
The episode Rest and Ricklaxation from Season 3 provides fascinating insight into Morty's identity through the separation of his healthy and toxic parts.
When his toxic traits are removed, Morty becomes confident, successful, and socially capable in ways that normal Morty is not. When we see toxic Morty separately, he is self-loathing, violent, and destructive.
A psychologist would observe that this episode suggests Morty's identity includes these conflicting elements, with his toxicity holding him back from success, while also perhaps protecting him through appropriate fear and caution. The question of which version is the real Morty, or whether real Morty is only complete when both aspects are integrated, creates interesting questions about identity and self-concept. Morty's relationship with Jessica, his longtime crush, also reflects his identity struggles. Across multiple seasons, Morty wants Jessica to like him and notice him, yet he struggles with feeling worthy of her attention or capable of having a relationship with her. The episode Rest and Ricklaxation shows that when Morty's insecurities are removed, he can successfully pursue and maintain a relationship with Jessica, suggesting that his identity as someone who cannot have what he wants is at least partly maintained by psychological factors rather than external reality. A psychologist would note that trauma and chronic stress can contribute to negative self-concept, where the person believes they do not deserve good things or cannot achieve their goals. The episode The Vat of Acid episode from Season 4 shows another aspect of identity strain through the save point device. Morty lives what feels like a full life, with a romantic partner, developing a relationship, and presumably a sense of himself as someone in a relationship. Someone who matters to another person. When he discovers this was all manipulated by Rick and none of it was real from the other person's perspective, Morty has to grapple with questions about whether that version of himself was real, whether those experiences count as part of his identity, even though they happened in reset timelines. A psychologist would observe that having significant identity-forming experiences erased or revealed as meaningless creates confusion about what aspects of your life and experience are real and count as part of who you are. Morty's academic struggles also contribute to identity strain. He is presented as not particularly smart academically, getting poor grades, struggling with school. When your grandfather is the smartest person in the universe and you are failing at school, this creates a painful contrast that affects how Morty sees himself intellectually. The episode M. Night Shame Aliens from Season 1 shows Morty struggling with math, and various episodes show him being mocked for his intelligence. A psychologist would note that repeated experiences of academic failure and being called stupid would affect how Morty thinks about his intellectual capabilities and his potential for future success. The moral complexity of Rick's adventures creates additional identity strain for Morty. Morty often finds himself in situations where there are no clearly right choices, where helping one person means hurting another, where survival requires doing things that violate his values. The episode Morty Night Run from Season 2 shows Morty trying to save an alien he feels responsible for, making choices that have unclear moral implications. A psychologist would observe that repeated exposure to morally ambiguous situations where there are no clear right answers can create confusion about your own moral identity and values. When you are forced to make difficult moral choices repeatedly, it becomes harder to maintain a clear sense of yourself as a good person with strong values. Morty's experiences with alternate versions of himself also create identity questions. Seeing other Mortys who made different choices, who have different relationships with their Ricks, who ended up in different situations, raises questions about how much of Morty's identity is determined by his choices versus his circumstances. The Evil Morty storyline across multiple seasons shows a version of Morty who responded to trauma and abuse by becoming calculating and ruthless. A psychologist would note that seeing what you could have become under different circumstances, or in response to the same experiences, creates identity confusion about whether your current self is inevitable or chosen. The episode Childrick of Mort from Season 4 involves questions about Rick potentially having other children he abandoned. For Morty, this raises questions about his own importance to Rick and whether his relationship with Rick is special or meaningful. A psychologist would observe that discovering your important relationships might not be as unique or significant as you thought can affect your sense of identity and your understanding of your place in other people's lives. Morty's sense of usefulness or purpose is another aspect of identity affected by trauma. In many adventures, Morty's role is to provide cover for Rick through camouflaging Rick's brainwaves, making Morty feel more like a tool than a person. The episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind establishes this explicitly. A psychologist would note that feeling like your primary value is instrumental, that you are useful for what you provide rather than valued for who you are, affects identity development by making it difficult to develop a sense of intrinsic worth, independent of your usefulness to others. The accumulation of traumatic experiences creates what psychologists might call a trauma-based identity, where traumatic experiences become central to how the person understands themselves. Morty might start to see himself primarily as someone who has been traumatized, someone who survives terrible things, someone defined by suffering rather than by positive characteristics, accomplishments, or relationships. A psychologist would observe that when trauma becomes central to identity, it can be difficult to imagine or create a different future, because trauma feels like the defining characteristic of who you are. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. This internal conflict around identity and self-worth shapes how Morty relates to others, affecting his capacity for connection and trust in relationships. Section 8. Interpersonal Strain and Relationships. A psychologist observing Morty would note that trauma does not just affect the individual experiencing it in isolation from others. Trauma also affects relationships and the person's ability to connect with others in healthy ways. Interpersonal strain refers to the difficulties and tensions that arise in relationships when someone is dealing with trauma. And these difficulties can manifest in various ways, including emotional withdrawal, irritability, difficulty trusting others, fear of intimacy, and changes in how the person communicates and relates to those around them. For Morty, his traumatic experiences create interpersonal strain across all his important relationships, including his relationship with Rick, his sister Summer, his parents, Beth and Jerry, his crush Jessica, and his peers at school. The relationship with Rick is the most obviously affected by Morty's trauma because Rick is the direct source of most of Morty's traumatic experiences across multiple seasons. A psychologist would observe that Morty's relationship with Rick is fundamentally unhealthy and characterized by patterns that create ongoing psychological harm. Rick repeatedly puts Morty in danger without adequately considering Morty's safety or well-being, dismisses Morty's feelings and concerns as unimportant, manipulates Morty into doing things against his will, and fails to provide the support and protection that a grandfather should provide to a vulnerable teenager. Despite this pattern of harmful treatment continuing across years, Morty continues to go on adventures with Rick and continues to seek Rick's approval and affection. The episode The Whirly-Durly Conspiracy from Season 3 shows complexity in Morty's feelings about his family members. In this episode, Morty contemplates letting Jerry die when presented with the opportunity, and goes through emotional processing about their relationship and what Jerry means to him. A psychologist would observe that trauma can create complicated and sometimes disturbing feelings toward family members, especially when those family members are part of the traumatic situation or fail to protect you from trauma. Morty's contemplation of Jerry's death, even though he ultimately saves Jerry and chooses not to let him die, shows how trauma and ongoing family dysfunction affect his capacity for normal familial affection and connection. Morty's relationship with Rick shows patterns of what psychologists call trauma bonding, where the person forms a strong attachment to someone who harms them because of the intermittent reinforcement of occasional positive experiences mixed with predominantly negative experiences. Rick occasionally shows Morty affection or does things that suggest he cares, such as saving Morty's life or making sacrifices. These occasional positive experiences create hope that the relationship could be consistently good, keeping Morty attached even as Rick continues to cause him harm through dangerous adventures.
A psychologist would observe that trauma bonding is particularly powerful because the occasional rewards feel intensely meaningful against the background of predominantly negative treatment, creating a cycle where the person keeps hoping for more positive moments while tolerating ongoing harm. The episode A Wrinkle in Time from Season 2 demonstrates this dynamic clearly. Rick appears to sacrifice himself to save Morty when they are caught in uncertain time, which creates a powerful emotional moment suggesting Rick genuinely cares about Morty's life. This moment likely strengthens Morty's attachment to Rick and his hope that Rick truly values him, even though Rick's behavior in most other episodes involves putting Morty in danger and treating him dismissively. A psychologist would note that these intermittent moments of apparent care make it difficult for Morty to maintain appropriate boundaries or to recognize the relationship as abusive, because the occasional positive moments create doubt about whether the relationship is truly harmful. Morty's relationship with Summer is also affected by his trauma experiences. Summer and Morty go on some adventures together, and Summer witnesses some of what Morty goes through with Rick. The episode Rick Mancing the Stone from Season 4 shows Morty and Summer using dangerous adventures in a post-apocalyptic world as escape from dealing with their parents' divorce. A psychologist would observe that siblings dealing with trauma can either support each other through shared understanding or can develop competitive or conflicted dynamics, especially when both are seeking the same parent or parental figures, attention and approval. Morty and Summer compete for Rick's attention at times, which creates strain in their sibling relationship that might not exist if they were not both dealing with family trauma. The episode Total Recall from Season 2 shows the family working together to identify and eliminate parasites that have infiltrated their home, which requires trust and collaboration between family members. However, a psychologist would note that the very premise of not knowing who is real and who is a parasite creates deep interpersonal strain based on inability to trust your own perceptions of relationships. Even after the parasites are eliminated and the family knows who is real, the experience of having to shoot beings you believed were family members could create lasting uncertainty about trusting your feelings about others and whether your relationships are genuine. Morty's relationship with his mother Beth is characterized by Beth's general emotional unavailability and her prioritization of her relationship with Rick over protecting Morty from Rick's harmful influence. The episode The ABCs of Beth from Season 3 focuses on Beth's relationship with Rick and her own psychological struggles stemming from Rick abandoning her as a child. A psychologist would observe that Beth's failure to protect Morty from ongoing traumatic experiences with Rick represents a form of neglect that contributes to Morty's trauma and affects their mother-son relationship. Morty cannot rely on Beth to keep him safe or to intervene when Rick's behavior becomes harmful, which creates insecurity in their attachment relationship. Morty's relationship with his father, Jerry, is complicated by Jerry's general ineffectiveness in the family, and by Morty's sometimes contemptuous attitude toward Jerry's weakness and inability to stand up to Rick. The episode Ricksty Minutes from Season 1 shows an alternate reality where Beth and Jerry's life is better and more successful without having had children, which affects how Morty sees his place in his parents' lives. A psychologist would note that knowing your parents might be happier or more successful without you affects your sense of security in those relationships and your sense of being valued and wanted by the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. Morty's peer relationships at school are also affected by his trauma experiences in ways that create social isolation. The episode Big Trouble in Little Sanchez from Season 2 shows Morty at school trying to manage normal teenage social dynamics and academic pressures while carrying the psychological burden of his adventures with Rick. A psychologist would observe that trauma can create a sense of being fundamentally different from peers who have not experienced similar things. Morty's experiences are so extreme and unusual that he likely feels unable to relate to his peers' normal teenage concerns about grades or social status, or to share his own experiences in ways they would understand or believe. This creates a barrier to forming genuine peer friendships. Morty's romantic interest in Jessica is affected by his trauma and identity struggles in ways that prevent him from forming the relationship he desires. Across multiple seasons, Morty struggles to connect with Jessica in meaningful ways, often freezing up or being unable to communicate effectively with her when given opportunities to interact. The episode Rest and Ricklaxation shows that when Morty's insecurities and negative traits are removed through the spa treatment, he can successfully pursue a relationship with Jessica and maintain her interest, suggesting that his trauma and its psychological effects
are directly interfering with his ability to form romantic connections.
A psychologist would note that trauma can affect romantic relationships through various mechanisms, including low self-worth, making you feel undeserving of love, difficulty with trust and vulnerability, making intimacy frightening, fear of rejection, abandonment, making you avoid pursuing relationships, and emotional numbing that makes it difficult to connect emotionally with potential partners. The episode, The Vat of Acid episode from Season 4, shows Morty developing what feels like a real romantic relationship during the Save Point experience, living what feels like weeks or months with a girl he genuinely connects with, only to have it revealed as not real from the other person's perspective because Morty kept resetting time. A psychologist would observe that this experience of developing intimacy and connection only to have it erased or invalidated could create fear of future romantic connections and difficulty trusting that relationships are real and meaningful rather than illusions. Trauma affects relationships through several specific mechanisms that we can observe in Morty's interactions across different episodes. First, emotional withdrawal and numbing make it difficult to be emotionally present with others. When someone is dealing with unprocessed trauma, they may not have the emotional capacity to fully engage in relationships because their emotional resources are being used to manage trauma symptoms like anxiety and hypervigilance. Morty's emotional blunting means he may have difficulty experiencing and expressing the full range of emotions that healthy relationships require, making it hard for others to connect with him or understand what he is feeling. Second, irritability and anger that are common trauma responses can create conflict in relationships, even with people Morty cares about. When someone is dealing with trauma, they may have a shorter fuse, may overreact to minor frustrations, or may express anger that is actually about the trauma but gets directed at people in their current life. The episode The Rickchurian Morty Date from Season 3 shows Morty expressing anger and frustration toward Rick more directly, which could represent healthy boundary setting, or could represent irritability from accumulated trauma stress that makes it harder to regulate emotional responses. Third, difficulty with trust makes it hard to form and maintain close relationships with anyone. When someone has been betrayed, manipulated, or hurt by people they trusted, they may develop a general difficulty trusting others, even in safe relationships. Morty has been repeatedly betrayed and manipulated by Rick across multiple seasons, which likely affects his ability to trust others, including friends, romantic partners, and other family members. A psychologist would observe that trust issues from trauma can create a pattern where the person expects betrayal or hurt in all relationships, which can become a self-fulfilling prophecy if their defensive behavior pushes others away. Fourth, fear of vulnerability makes intimacy difficult across all types of relationships. Intimacy requires being open about your feelings, needs, and experiences, which requires vulnerability and willingness to risk being hurt. When someone has been hurt, especially during moments of vulnerability when they were open about their needs or feelings, they may protect themselves by avoiding vulnerability in future relationships. Morty rarely opens up about his true feelings or experiences, and when he does express vulnerability, he is often dismissed or mocked by Rick. This pattern likely reinforces his tendency to keep his feelings private and to avoid vulnerability, even in relationships where it might actually be safe to be open. Fifth, communication difficulties can arise from trauma and affect all relationships. People dealing with trauma may struggle to articulate their feelings and needs clearly, may avoid discussing difficult topics that remind them of trauma, or may communicate in indirect or unclear ways that make it hard for others to understand what they need. Morty often does not directly communicate his concerns or boundaries to Rick, instead going along with adventures he does not want to go on, or expressing discomfort only through hesitation rather than clear refusal. A psychologist would observe that difficulty with direct communication makes it hard to have healthy relationships where both people's needs are expressed clearly and respected. The episode Morty Night Run from Season 2 shows Morty trying to save an alien he feels responsible for, making independent moral choices separate from Rick's pragmatic approach. A psychologist would note that this represents Morty trying to maintain his own moral identity and make his own decisions about relationships and obligations, despite Rick's influence and control. The strain of maintaining your own values and relationships while being controlled by someone else creates interpersonal difficulties across all domains of life,
The episode Childrick of Mort from Season 4 involves Rick potentially having children he abandoned, which affects how Morty sees Rick's capacity for parental relationships and commitment to family. A psychologist would observe that discovering someone you depend on may have abandoned other people who depended on them creates anxiety about your own relationship security and whether you might also be abandoned if you become inconvenient or burdensome. Morty's experiences with other versions of himself, particularly evil Morty, who appears across multiple seasons, also affect his understanding of relationships. Evil Morty represents what can happen when a Morty is pushed too far. When the trauma and abuse become too much, and the person responds by becoming cold, calculating, and willing to harm others for their own goals and freedom. A psychologist would note that seeing this potential version of yourself affects how you understand your own capacity for harm and your relationships with others who might push you toward that transformation. The pattern across Morty's relationship shows someone struggling to connect authentically while dealing with significant trauma that affects his capacity for trust, vulnerability, emotional expression, and healthy boundaries. A psychologist would observe that without intervention and support to process his trauma, these interpersonal difficulties are likely to persist and potentially worsen over time as trauma accumulates and relationship patterns become more entrenched and harder to change. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Trauma also impacts Morty's everyday functioning and the coping strategies he develops to manage his distress. Section 9. Trauma's effects on functioning and coping. A psychologist observing Morty would note that trauma does not just affect emotions and relationships. Trauma also affects everyday functioning, which means how well someone can manage the normal tasks and demands of daily life. Functioning includes things like going to school, doing homework, maintaining personal hygiene, sleeping and eating regularly, managing responsibilities, and generally being able to do what needs to be done each day. When someone experiences trauma, their functioning can be impaired in various ways, and they often develop coping strategies to manage their distress and to try to continue functioning despite their symptoms. Some coping strategies are healthy and adaptive, helping the person manage stress while moving toward recovery. Other coping strategies are unhealthy or maladaptive, providing temporary relief while creating additional problems or preventing genuine healing. The episode Big Trouble in Little Sanchez from Season 2 shows Morty trying to function at school while dealing with the psychological burden of his adventures with Rick. In this episode, Morty is shown struggling with normal school activities and social interactions. A psychologist would observe that Morty's trauma and stress from adventures affects his ability to focus on schoolwork, to engage with peers, and to care about normal teenage concerns. His mind is preoccupied with processing traumatic experiences and managing anxiety about future adventures, which leaves less mental and emotional energy available for school and social functioning. Morty's academic performance across the series suggests functional impairment in the educational domain. He is shown getting poor grades, struggling to complete assignments, and having difficulty paying attention in class. While some of this could be attributed to lack of interest or ability, a psychologist would note that trauma and chronic stress significantly impair cognitive functions necessary for academic success, including attention, memory, executive function, and motivation. When someone's mind is constantly dealing with trauma symptoms like hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts, and emotional dysregulation, it becomes very difficult to focus on abstract academic material or to care about grades and assignments. The episode Rixie Business from Season 1 shows Morty trying to manage responsibilities at home when Rick throws a party that gets out of control. Morty attempts to clean up and fix problems while dealing with increasing chaos. A psychologist would observe that Morty shows some functional capacity to problem solve and manage crises, which suggests that his trauma has not completely impaired his ability to function. However, the level of stress and anxiety Morty displays during crisis situations suggests he is functioning in a state of chronic stress activation rather than calm, effective coping. Sleep is one area of functioning commonly affected by trauma. While the show does not focus heavily on Morty's sleep patterns, there are scenes showing Morty being dragged out of bed by Rick in the middle of the night for adventures, and scenes suggesting Morty has difficulty sleeping or has disturbing dreams. The pilot episode shows Rick waking Morty from sleep to go on an adventure.
A psychologist would note that disrupted sleep is both a symptom of trauma and a factor that makes trauma symptoms worse, because sleep is essential for emotional regulation and cognitive functioning. When sleep is frequently disrupted, the person's ability to manage stress and emotions during waking hours is significantly impaired. Morty's coping strategies vary across episodes and situations, showing a range of both healthy and unhealthy approaches to managing his distress. One coping strategy Morty sometimes uses is avoidance, where he tries to avoid reminders of trauma or situations that trigger trauma responses. The episode Pickle Rick from Season 3 shows the family preparing for therapy. And while Rick is the one who goes to extreme lengths to avoid therapy, Morty's participation in family avoidance of difficult topics represents a coping pattern, where uncomfortable emotional experiences are avoided rather than processed. Another coping strategy Morty uses is seeking reassurance or support from others, though he does this inconsistently. There are moments when Morty tries to talk to Summer about what he is experiencing, or tries to seek comfort from family members. However, a psychologist would observe that Morty often does not receive adequate support when he seeks it, which may discourage him from using this coping strategy in the future. When coping strategies do not work or lead to negative outcomes, people tend to abandon those strategies, even if they would be healthy approaches in a supportive environment. The episode Rest and Ricklaxation from Season 3 shows Morty and Rick seeking treatment for their accumulated stress and trauma through the spa's detox process. This represents a coping strategy of seeking professional or technological help to manage psychological distress. A psychologist would observe that recognizing the need for help and actively seeking treatment is a healthy coping response, even though the specific treatment method in this episode is not realistic. The fact that Morty recognizes he is struggling and needs intervention shows some level of adaptive coping and self-awareness. Emotional expression is another important coping mechanism, and Morty shows varying capacity for expressing his emotions across the series. Sometimes Morty expresses fear, sadness, or anger openly, while other times he suppresses or hides his emotions. The episode Morty Night Run from Season 2 shows Morty expressing his feelings about moral responsibility and guilt, trying to work through these difficult emotions by talking about them and by taking action to fix what he perceives as his mistake. A psychologist would note that appropriate emotional expression is a healthy coping mechanism that helps process difficult experiences, while suppression of emotions tends to maintain distress and prevent healing. Distraction and escapism represent another category of coping strategies Morty uses. Engaging in normal teenage activities like pursuing his crush Jessica, playing video games, or spending time with friends serves as distraction from trauma-related distress. The episode Night Shame Aliens from Season 1 shows Morty playing video games and trying to engage in normal activities. A psychologist would observe that healthy distraction can provide necessary breaks from trauma processing and can help maintain connection to normal life and identity. However, excessive use of distraction to avoid ever processing trauma becomes an unhealthy avoidance pattern. The episode Rick Mancing the Stone from Season 4 shows Morty using dangerous adventures as a form of escapism from dealing with his parents' divorce. This represents an unhealthy coping strategy where Morty seeks out intense experiences to avoid processing painful emotions about his family situation. A psychologist would note that while seeking intense experiences can temporarily distract from emotional pain, it does not resolve the underlying issues and can create additional trauma and stress. Morty sometimes uses humor as a coping mechanism, making jokes or responding to serious situations with attempts at levity. While humor can be a healthy coping mechanism when used appropriately, a psychologist would observe that using humor to deflect from genuinely processing difficult emotions or to avoid acknowledging the seriousness of traumatic experiences represents unhealthy avoidance. The line between healthy humor that helps manage stress and unhealthy humor that prevents processing is not always clear. Problem-solving and taking action represent more adaptive coping strategies that Morty displays in various episodes. When Morty encounters a problem, he often tries to actively solve it rather than passively accepting negative outcomes.
The episode Morty Night Run shows Morty taking action to save the alien he feels responsible for, using problem-focused coping to address a moral concern. A psychologist would note that problem-focused coping works well when dealing with problems that can actually be solved, but can become maladaptive when applied to situations that cannot be changed or controlled. The episode, The Vat of Acid episode from Season 4, shows Morty using the save point device to cope with anxiety about consequences and mistakes. By being able to reset reality when things go wrong, Morty temporarily escapes from the normal anxiety that comes with making decisions with permanent consequences. A psychologist would observe that this represents an unhealthy coping pattern of avoiding normal developmental challenges around accepting consequences and learning from mistakes, even though Morty did not create this coping mechanism himself, but, rather, was given the device by Rick. Morty's attempts to maintain normal routines and identity despite his traumatic experiences represent another coping approach. He continues going to school, continues pursuing Jessica, continues interacting with his family in relatively normal ways despite the extreme abnormality of his adventures with Rick. A psychologist would note that maintaining connection to normal life and normal identity can be a protective factor that prevents trauma from completely overwhelming the person's sense of self and daily functioning. Social withdrawal is a coping strategy Morty uses at times, pulling away from others when feeling overwhelmed or distressed. The episode Rick Potion number 9 inches ends with Morty sitting silently at dinner after the traumatic experience of burying his own body, demonstrating withdrawal from social engagement as a response to overwhelming emotion. A psychologist would observe that some degree of withdrawal can be necessary for processing difficult experiences, but chronic or excessive withdrawal prevents the social connection and support that aid in recovery from trauma. Emotional volatility, where emotions shift rapidly or intensely, can be both a symptom of trauma and a form of coping with overwhelming internal experiences. When someone feels too much emotion to manage, their emotional expression may become volatile as they struggle to regulate what they are feeling. Morty shows moments of emotional volatility across episodes, shifting between fear, anger, sadness, and other intense emotions. A psychologist would note that this volatility represents impaired emotional regulation, resulting from trauma and stress. The episode The Wedding Squanchers from Season 2 shows Morty dealing with extreme stress as his world is literally taken over by the Federation. His coping during this crisis involves trying to maintain family cohesion and dealing with immediate practical needs while Rick is gone. A psychologist would observe that crisis coping often looks different from everyday coping, with people sometimes able to function well during acute crises while struggling more during periods of lower intensity chronic stress. Anxiety is a common response Morty shows after traumatic experiences, and how he copes with this anxiety varies. Sometimes Morty's anxiety manifests as physical symptoms, like tension or difficulty breathing, which he must manage while trying to function normally. Sometimes his anxiety manifests as worry and rumination about future dangers or past mistakes. A psychologist would note that anxiety after trauma serves the function of trying to predict and prepare for future threats, but often becomes excessive and impairs functioning rather than providing useful protection. The episode Childrick of Mort from Season 4 shows Morty dealing with complex family situations while trying to maintain his equilibrium. His coping involves trying to stay out of the chaos while also being pulled into it, representing an approach where Morty tries to minimize his involvement in stressful situations while maintaining necessary family connections. A psychologist would observe that this balancing act between engagement and self-protection is a common coping challenge for people in dysfunctional family systems. Morty's functioning and coping patterns show someone who is struggling but not completely overwhelmed. Someone who has developed various strategies to manage ongoing stress and trauma while maintaining some degree of normal teenage life. A psychologist would observe that the fact that Morty continues to function at all despite his experiences is noteworthy, suggesting both some natural resilience and the development of coping mechanisms that, while not always healthy, allow him to continue getting through each day. However, the strain of maintaining functioning while dealing with unprocessed trauma is clearly taking a toll that manifests in impaired academic performance, relationship difficulties, emotional problems, and the various trauma symptoms discussed in previous sections. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These coping patterns tie into moral distress that Morty experiences when forced to participate in or witness events that violate his values and sense of right and wrong. Section 10.
Guilt and moral discomfort. A psychologist observing Morty would note that in addition to the fear, anxiety, and other emotional responses that come from traumatic experiences, Morty also experiences significant guilt and moral discomfort related to his adventures with Rick. Moral distress occurs when someone is involved in situations that violate their values, when they participate in actions they believe are wrong, or when they fail to prevent harm they believe should have been prevented. For someone like Morty, who has a strong moral compass and sense of empathy, being repeatedly placed in morally compromising situations creates ongoing internal conflict that adds to his psychological burden beyond the trauma of danger and violence alone. The episode Rick Potion number 9 from Season 1 provides an early and significant example of Morty's moral distress and guilt. In this episode, Morty asks Rick to make a love potion for Jessica, which leads to catastrophic consequences, including turning the entire human population into monsters. Morty feels deeply responsible for what happened, even though he could not have predicted the outcome, and even though Rick was the one who created the potion and failed to make it safe. A psychologist would observe that Morty's guilt in this situation goes beyond reasonable responsibility. He blames himself for asking Rick to make the potion in the first place, for wanting Jessica to like him, for all the consequences that followed from this initial request. This represents a pattern where Morty takes on responsibility and guilt for outcomes that were not primarily his fault or that he could not have prevented with his limited knowledge and power. The moral weight of abandoning his original dimension and family compounds this guilt significantly. Morty had to leave behind his real mother, father, and sister, who are now transformed into monsters in another dimension, and has to live in a dimension that is not truly his while pretending to be a version of himself who died. A psychologist would note that this creates complex moral and existential guilt about abandoning people he loves even though there was no way to save them, about living a life that does not belong to him, and about the deception involved in replacing the dead Morty without anyone knowing the truth. This guilt likely affects how Morty relates to his family in the new dimension, creating distance and inauthenticity in relationships that should be close and genuine, because he knows these are not technically his real family members. The episode Me Seeks and Destroy from Season 1 shows Morty experiencing guilt and moral distress after the attempted assault in the bathroom. While Morty successfully fought off the attacker and is clearly the victim in this situation, he later sees Rick kill the attacker in revenge, and knows this killing was done on his behalf. A psychologist would observe that Morty may experience complicated feelings about this, including potential guilt about the death, even though he did nothing wrong and was defending himself from assault. Survivors of assault often experience inappropriate guilt, blaming themselves for what happened or for the consequences that follow, even when rationally they know they are not at fault. The episode Look Who's Purging Now from Season 2 demonstrates moral distress most clearly through Morty's participation in violence during the purge. Morty initially resists the violence strongly and tries to avoid participating in the killing happening around him, consistent with his baseline moral values about not hurting others. However, as the situation escalates and his emotions intensify, Morty gets caught up in the violence and participates in killing people himself, going beyond what is necessary for simple self-defense. A psychologist would recognize this as a form of moral injury, where someone acts in ways that violate their core values during extreme circumstances. After the violence ends and Morty returns to normal life, he has to live with the knowledge that he killed people, that he got caught up in violence and even seemed to enjoy it in the moment, and that some part of him was capable of these actions. This creates lasting guilt and moral discomfort about his own capacity for violence, and about what kind of person he might be underneath his normal moral restraint. The guilt from moral injury is different from guilt about making a simple mistake. When you make a mistake, you can apologize, make amends, and try to do better in the future. Moral injury involves having acted in ways that fundamentally contradict your understanding of yourself as a good person, which creates a deeper level of guilt that is harder to resolve. A psychologist would note that Morty's participation in violence during the purge likely changed how he sees himself morally, introducing doubt about whether he is truly a good person, or whether he is capable of terrible things under the right circumstances. The episode Morty Night Run from Season 2 shows Morty dealing with moral responsibility in a different way. In this episode, Morty helps an alien assassin named Fart escape from captivity because he believes it is wrong to keep the alien imprisoned and sold. However,
Rick warns Morty that Fart will likely kill many people if set free, based on Fart's stated intentions about eliminating carbon-based life. Morty faces a moral dilemma where both choices have negative consequences. If he leaves Fart imprisoned, he is complicit in what he sees as unjust captivity and exploitation. If he frees Fart, he may be responsible for future deaths that result from this choice. Eventually, Morty makes the difficult choice to kill Fart himself to prevent these future deaths. A psychologist would observe that this represents moral distress from being placed in impossible situations where every choice violates some moral principle, creating a no-win scenario where Morty will carry guilt regardless of what he chooses. The episode Total Recall from Season 2 creates moral distress through forcing Morty to kill beings he believes are family and friends. Even though these beings turn out to be parasites rather than real people, Morty's experience during the killing is one of shooting people he cares about. A psychologist would note that the emotional and moral experience during the act is what matters psychologically, not just the objective reality discovered afterward. Morty experienced the guilt and horror of killing loved ones in the moment, and that experience likely affects him even after learning they were not real, because the psychological trauma of the experience occurred before he knew the truth. The episode The Wedding Squanchers from Season 2 involves Morty being part of a wedding massacre and having to deal with the moral complexity of survival in violent circumstances. While Morty is not the one causing the violence, he is present during extreme violence and death at a celebration that was supposed to be joyful, and he benefits from Rick's actions that involve killing Federation agents. A psychologist would observe that moral distress can come not just from your own actions, but from being complicit in or benefiting from the harmful actions of others, especially when those actions are taken on your behalf or to protect you. Morty's moral distress extends to his ongoing participation in Rick's adventures, despite knowing that these adventures often involve harm to others. Every time Morty goes on an adventure with Rick, knowing from experience that Rick's adventures frequently involve violence, exploitation of others, or ethically questionable activities, Morty becomes complicit in whatever happens even when he is not the one making the decisions. The episode Ricksy Business from Season 1 shows Morty knowing that Rick throwing a party will lead to problems, yet not stopping it or warning his parents adequately. A psychologist would note that remaining silent or failing to prevent harm you know is likely to occur can create moral guilt even when you are not the one directly causing the harm. The episode Rest and Ricklaxation from Season 3 shows that when Morty's negative emotions and traits are removed through the spa treatment, he becomes more successful, but also loses his moral sensitivity and concern. Healthy Morty is able to pursue Jessica successfully and achieve conventional success, while toxic Morty contains all the guilt, anxiety, and moral concern. A psychologist would observe that this suggests Morty's moral distress and guilt are deeply intertwined with his personality and sense of self. Removing the guilt removes something essential about who Morty is, including his capacity for moral concern and empathy that makes him care about right and wrong. The episode The Whirly-Durly Conspiracy from Season 3 shows Morty contemplating allowing Jerry to die, which creates moral conflict between his personal feelings of frustration with Jerry and his moral beliefs about the value of human life. A psychologist would note that even contemplating such an action likely creates guilt, especially for someone with Morty's strong moral sensitivity. The fact that Morty ultimately saves Jerry does not erase the guilt about having considered letting him die, or about feeling relief at the prospect of Jerry being gone. The episode The Vat of Acid episode from Season 4 involves Morty using the save point device to live without consequences, which might seem to avoid moral distress by allowing Morty to undo any mistakes or harmful actions. However, a psychologist would observe that living without genuine consequences creates its own moral problems. Morty develops a relationship with a girl while using the save point, treating her as a real person with real feelings. Yet he is the only one who remembers their time together because he kept resetting. This raises moral questions about using people in ways they cannot consent to because they do not know what is happening, treating real people as if they exist in a video game where Morty can reset when things go wrong. The episode Childrick of Mort from Season 4 involves Morty dealing with Rick's potential abandonment of children, which creates moral distress about continuing to maintain a relationship with someone who may have committed serious moral wrongs.
A psychologist would note that discovering people you care about have done terrible things creates moral conflict between loyalty and values, between wanting to believe the best about them and confronting evidence of serious moral failures. Morty often expresses his guilt and moral discomfort verbally, trying to process these feelings by talking about them or by explaining why certain actions feel wrong to him. The episode Morty Night Run shows Morty arguing with Rick about moral principles and defending his decision to free fart based on moral reasoning about rights and dignity. A psychologist would observe that Morty's willingness to articulate and defend his moral positions, despite Rick's mockery, shows some moral resilience and strength, even as the ongoing moral conflicts create psychological distress that accumulates over time. The accumulation of moral distress across multiple seasons creates what psychologists call moral burden, where the weight of accumulated guilt and moral compromise becomes increasingly heavy to carry. Each new morally compromising situation adds to existing unresolved moral distress, creating a growing psychological burden that affects how Morty sees himself and experiences his daily life. A psychologist would note that without opportunities to process and resolve moral guilt through making amends, receiving forgiveness, or somehow repairing the harm done, moral distress accumulates and intensifies over time. Morty's moral distress is complicated by the fact that he often has limited control over situations he is placed in. He is forced into adventures he did not choose, placed in moral dilemmas he did not create, and expected to make impossible choices with limited information and limited power. A psychologist would observe that this creates a particular type of moral distress, where the person feels responsible for outcomes they could not control, creating guilt that is difficult to resolve because there was no clear right choice, or because the situation itself was imposed rather than chosen. The pattern across episodes shows Morty carrying increasing moral burden as he accumulates experiences that violate his values, that force him to act in ways he believes are wrong, or that make him complicit in harm to others. A psychologist would recognize that this ongoing moral distress contributes significantly to Morty's overall psychological struggles, and would note that moral injury can be just as psychologically damaging as fear-based trauma, creating lasting changes to how the person sees themselves and the world. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Trauma also appears in how Morty approaches risks and his patterns of avoidance or caution in different types of situations. Section 11. Risk aversion and avoidance patterns. A psychologist observing Morty across the series would note changes in how he approaches risk and danger over time. In early seasons, Morty's responses to danger were primarily characterized by fear and protest. Yet he generally went along with whatever Rick wanted, despite his discomfort. As the series progresses and Morty accumulates more traumatic experiences, patterns of risk aversion and avoidance become more visible in his behavior. Risk aversion means becoming more cautious about entering dangerous situations or taking actions that might lead to negative outcomes. Avoidance means actively trying to stay away from situations, people, or experiences that trigger anxiety or remind the person of past trauma. Both risk aversion and avoidance are common psychological responses to repeated trauma and can be adaptive in some contexts while becoming problematic when they are excessive or when they prevent necessary activities. The pilot episode shows Morty's baseline response to risk. When Rick drags him out of bed for a dangerous adventure, Morty protests and expresses fear. Yet he ultimately goes along with Rick's plan without significant resistance or avoidance. A psychologist would note that early Morty shows appropriate fear responses to danger, but does not yet have the learned association between adventures with Rick and traumatic outcomes that would create strong avoidance motivation. He is scared in the moment, but he has not yet learned to anticipate and avoid the pattern of trauma that adventures represent. The episode Me Seeks and Destroy from Season 1 shows an early example of Morty trying to exercise some control over the risks he is exposed to. When Morty insists on choosing an adventure, he specifically chooses what he thinks will be a safer, more fun option compared to Rick's typical dangerous adventures. A psychologist would observe that this represents an early attempt at risk management, where Morty tries to reduce his exposure to danger by selecting adventures he perceives as less risky. However, this adventure still goes badly, which may reinforce for Morty that he cannot control or avoid danger even when he tries to choose safer options.
The episode Total Recall from Season 2 shows the family dealing with parasites, and during this episode, Morty must participate in identifying and shooting the parasites. A psychologist would note that Morty shows some hesitation and distress about the violence required, representing a form of avoidance where he is reluctant to engage in actions that cause harm, even when those actions are necessary for survival. His hesitation must be overcome by the urgency of the situation, rather than Morty freely choosing to act. The episode Look Who's Purging Now from Season 2 demonstrates complex patterns around risk and violence. Initially, Morty tries to avoid the violence of the purge, representing healthy risk aversion, where he recognizes danger and tries to stay away from it. However, as discussed in previous sections, he eventually gets caught up in the violence. A psychologist would observe that this episode shows how avoidance can break down under extreme stress, where the person's usual coping mechanisms and behavioral controls fail when overwhelmed by the intensity of the situation. The episode The Wedding Squanchers from Season 2 forces Morty into a high-risk situation without any option for avoidance. The wedding is attacked by the Federation, and Morty has no choice but to be present during the violence. A psychologist would note that when avoidance is not possible and the person must face the feared situation, this can either lead to increased fear and trauma symptoms, or in some cases can provide exposure that reduces fear over time if the person successfully copes with the situation. However, traumatic exposure without adequate processing and support typically increases rather than decreases fear and avoidance tendencies. The episode Vindicators 3, The Return of Worldender from Season 3 shows Morty wanting to go on an adventure with the Vindicators superhero team. A psychologist would observe that Morty's enthusiasm for this particular adventure suggests his risk assessment is influenced by factors beyond simple danger level. He is excited about adventures with heroes he admires, while being more reluctant about typical adventures with Rick. This suggests that Morty's risk aversion is not absolute or generalized to all dangerous situations, but rather is more specific to certain types of risks or certain contexts. The episode The Rickchurian Morty Date from Season 3 shows Morty becoming more assertive with Rick and more willing to challenge Rick's decisions. While this could be interpreted as reduced fear, a psychologist might also observe this as Morty beginning to set boundaries and engage in a form of avoidance, where he tries to limit Rick's control over his life and his exposure to Rick's dangerous plans. Assertiveness and boundary setting can be healthy forms of risk management, where the person reduces their exposure to harm by saying no to dangerous situations. The episode Edge of Tomorty, Rick Die Rickpeat from Season 4 involves Rick dying repeatedly, and Morty's responses to these deaths show some adaptation over time. Initially, each death is distressing, but as deaths accumulate, Morty's distress decreases somewhat. A psychologist would note that this could represent either healthy adaptation and emotional regulation, or unhealthy emotional numbing and desensitization. The distinction depends on whether Morty is genuinely processing and coping with the experience, or whether he is simply shutting down emotionally to avoid feeling the full impact of repeated loss. A psychologist would observe that Morty's participation, without significant protest or avoidance, suggests he has become somewhat habituated to dangerous situations, where what would have terrified early season Morty now feels relatively manageable, or at least unavoidable. This habituation can be seen as a form of adaptation that allows continued functioning, or as concerning desensitization that indicates Morty's normal fear responses and self-protection instincts have been eroded by repeated trauma exposure. The episode Childrick of Mort from Season 4 shows Morty dealing with complicated family situations, and his behavior suggests patterns of avoidance around emotional intimacy and difficult family dynamics rather than just physical danger. A psychologist would note that avoidance patterns from trauma often generalize beyond the specific type of situation that cause trauma. Someone who experienced trauma involving physical danger may also develop avoidance of emotional vulnerability, social situations, or anything that creates stress or discomfort similar to what they experienced during trauma. The episode Rattlestar Ricklactica from Season 4 involves Morty accidentally killing a snake, which leads to cascading problems. Morty's distress about killing the snake and his attempts to fix what he broke represent a pattern where Morty tries to avoid guilt and moral responsibility by fixing mistakes,
rather than living with having caused harm. A psychologist would observe that this represents a form of avoidance of uncomfortable emotions, where Morty engages in frantic action to avoid having to feel guilt. The episode Star Mort Return of the Jerry from Season 4 involves space battles and family revelations. Morty's relative calm during these events, compared to his responses in early seasons, could represent risk habituation, emotional numbing, or genuine development of coping skills. A psychologist would note that distinguishing between healthy adaptation and problematic desensitization requires understanding whether Morty is maintaining appropriate caution and whether his reduced fear responses are helping or hindering his functioning and well-being. The episode Mort Dinner Rick Andre from Season 5 shows Rick manipulating time to avoid family dinner, and Morty is caught up in these manipulations. Morty's participation without stronger resistance could represent learned helplessness, where repeated experiences of being unable to control situations or avoid Rick's plans has taught Morty that resistance is futile. A psychologist would recognize learned helplessness as a pattern where the person stops trying to avoid negative situations because past attempts at avoidance have consistently failed. The episode Rick Dependence Spray from Season 5 involves deeply embarrassing circumstances for Morty. His handling of this situation suggests some capacity to cope with embarrassment and social threat, though a psychologist might also observe avoidance patterns in how Morty deals with the social consequences, possibly withdrawing from peers or avoiding situations where he might be mocked. The episode Forgetting Sarek Mortshaw from Season 5 involves memory manipulation. Morty's relative acceptance of discovering his memories have been manipulated could represent concerning numbness to reality violations, or could represent adaptive acceptance of things he cannot control. A psychologist would note that excessive acceptance of unacceptable situations can be a form of learned helplessness, where the person stops fighting against violations because fighting has not successfully prevented violations in the past. Patterns of avoidance are particularly evident in how Morty sometimes tries to maintain distance from Rick, or tries to avoid going on adventures. There are episodes where Morty expresses reluctance or tries to decline participation, though these attempts are typically overridden by Rick's manipulation or by circumstances that force Morty's participation. A psychologist would observe that when avoidance attempts consistently fail, the person may eventually stop trying to avoid, leading to what appears like willing participation, but is actually resigned compliance. The concept of approach-avoidance conflict is relevant to understanding Morty's behavior. Morty simultaneously wants things that adventures provide, such as Rick's approval, exciting experiences, and escape from normal life, while also wanting to avoid the dangers and traumas adventures involve. This creates psychological conflict where Morty is pulled toward and pushed away from the same situations simultaneously. A psychologist would note that approach avoidance conflict creates significant psychological distress and can lead to ambivalent or inconsistent behavior patterns. Morty's avoidance is not always about physical danger. He also shows patterns of emotional avoidance, where he tries to avoid feeling or expressing difficult emotions. This might manifest as humor, distraction, or simply not talking about traumatic experiences. The fact that Morty rarely discusses his adventures with family members who were not present could represent a form of avoidance, where talking about trauma feels too difficult, or where Morty anticipates not being believed or understood. Social avoidance is another pattern that may be present in Morty's behavior. His difficulties connecting with peers and his sense of being different from other teenagers could lead to avoiding social situations where these differences become apparent. A psychologist would note that trauma-related social avoidance can create a cycle where the person becomes more isolated, which increases psychological distress, which increases avoidance, creating a self-reinforcing pattern of isolation. The episode Big Trouble in Little Sanchez from Season 2 shows Morty at school, and his behavior suggests some degree of compartmentalization, where he tries to maintain separation between his school life and his adventure life. This compartmentalization functions as a form of avoidance, where Morty tries to keep trauma-related experiences from contaminating his normal teenage life. A psychologist would observe that compartmentalization can be adaptive in allowing some domains of life to remain functional, but can also prevent integration of experiences and processing of trauma. Risk aversion and avoidance become problematic problematic when they prevent necessary activities or when they are based on overestimation of danger in situations that are actually safe. A psychologist would need to assess whether Morty's caution represents appropriate assessment of real dangers in his life, or whether trauma has created excessive fear that prevents normal activities. Given that Morty's life genuinely involves extreme danger regularly, some degree of risk aversion seems appropriate and adaptive rather than excessive. The challenge for Morty is that the dangerous situations are not optional or easily avoidable. He cannot simply stop going on adventures with Rick without confronting Rick directly and potentially losing his relationship with his grandfather. This creates a situation where healthy avoidance of trauma triggers is not really possible, forcing Morty to develop other coping mechanisms besides avoidance. A psychologist would recognize this as a particularly difficult situation, where the normal recommendation to avoid trauma reminders and create safety is not feasible given Morty's family circumstances. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. All of these patterns combine into a broader psychological picture that reveals how trauma-like responses have fundamentally shaped Morty's character development and narrative arc across the series. Section 12. How trauma-like responses shape Morty's narrative. A psychologist observing Morty across all 8 seasons would recognize that the patterns we have examined, including his baseline emotional sensitivity, his repeated exposure to violence and danger, the persistent psychological strain he experiences, his emotional blunting and detachment, his explicit declaration of having PTSD, his flashbacks and trauma triggers, his identity struggles, his interpersonal difficulties, his impaired functioning and coping patterns, his moral distress and guilt, and his risk aversion and avoidance behaviors all combine to create a comprehensive picture of someone whose mental and emotional landscape has been fundamentally changed by traumatic experiences. This is not a story about a character who experiences difficult events and then simply returns to normal functioning and baseline personality. Life. When we first met Morty in the pilot episode from December 2013, he was a nervous but relatively normal 14-year-old boy with appropriate emotional responses to danger and a baseline personality characterized by empathy, anxiety, and moral sensitivity. He cared deeply about others. He felt fear in proportion to actual threats, and he had a clear sense of right and wrong that guided his behavior and created distress when violated. Across the series spanning 8 seasons, we have watched this baseline personality be shaped and changed by hundreds of traumatic experiences, creating visible changes in how Morty responds to events, how he relates to others, how he sees himself, and how he functions in daily life. A psychologist would observe that these changes represent the natural psychological consequences of chronic trauma exposure during a critical developmental period. Morty's adolescent brain and developing personality have been shaped by trauma in ways that will likely have lasting effects into his adulthood, affecting who he becomes as a person and how he navigates relationships and challenges throughout his life. The show uses Morty's character to explore psychological themes that are real and relevant to understanding human responses to trauma, even though the specific circumstances of his trauma involve sci-fi elements like interdimensional travel, alien encounters, and advanced technology that do not exist in reality. A psychologist would note that the psychological principles underlying Morty's responses are grounded in genuine trauma psychology, studied through research and clinical practice. The flashbacks he experiences, the emotional numbing that develops over time, the guilt he carries from moral violations, the relationship difficulties he faces, the identity confusion he struggles with, these are all recognized responses to trauma that appear in research literature and in clinical work with trauma survivors. The show takes these real psychological phenomena and presents them through the lens of exaggerated sci-fi storytelling, making them visible and dramatic in ways that help viewers recognize and understand these patterns that might be more subtle or hidden in real life. The explicit moment in Summer of All Fears from Season 8, where Morty states, "I had PTSD," represents the show making explicit what had been implicit throughout previous seasons. This moment acknowledges that what we have been watching is not just comedy and adventure for entertainment, but also a story about psychological trauma and its effects on a developing person. Character quirks, personality development, or plot devices serving the comedy. Morty's story reflects real issues that many people face in various contexts, including children and adolescents who grow up in unstable or harmful family environments, who are exposed to violence or danger, whether through community violence or family dysfunction, who feel unable to escape situations that harm them due to dependence or lack of resources, or who struggle with the psychological aftermath of traumatic experiences. While most people do not face the extreme sci-fi dangers Morty encounters, like alien invasions or interdimensional wars, the psychological processes of fear, guilt, emotional numbing, relationship difficulties, and identity confusion that result from trauma are universal human experiences that occur regardless of the specific type of trauma. A psychologist would note that Morty's story can help viewers understand trauma responses in themselves or others by presenting these responses in a visible, dramatic form that makes abstract psychological concepts concrete and recognizable. The relationship between Morty and Rick serves as the central dynamic through which trauma is delivered and through which Morty's responses develop over time. Rick is simultaneously the source of most of Morty's trauma through the dangerous adventures, and the person Morty remains attached to and dependent on for various reasons, including family connection, intermittent positive experiences, and lack of other options for escaping his circumstances. A psychologist would recognize this as representing dynamics that occur in families where a parent or caregiver is also the source of harm to a child, creating complex attachment patterns where the person who should provide safety and protection is, instead, the source of danger. The trauma bonding we see between Rick and Morty, the conflicted feelings Morty has about their relationship, the difficulty Morty has setting and maintaining boundaries, the ongoing exposure to harm despite negative consequences, these patterns reflect real psychological dynamics in harmful family relationships that many people experience. Morty's accumulated experiences across 8 seasons demonstrate how trauma is not just about individual events, but about patterns over time, and about how experiences build on each other. Each traumatic experience Morty has does not exist in isolation from other experiences. Each new trauma adds to and interacts with previous unprocessed trauma, creating cumulative effects that are greater than the sum of individual events. A psychologist would observe that this cumulative trauma model, where repeated traumatic experiences without adequate recovery periods create compounding psychological effects, accurately represents what research and clinical experience show about how chronic trauma affects people over extended periods. The psychological burden grows not linearly, but exponentially, as each new trauma is layered onto existing, unresolved trauma. The show does not present Morty's trauma as something that will be easily resolved or fixed through a simple intervention. There is no episode where Morty goes to therapy and is cured after one session. No moment where he confronts his trauma directly and suddenly becomes his old self again. Instead, the show presents trauma as an ongoing condition that Morty lives with day to day, that affects his daily life in multiple ways, and that shapes who he is becoming as a person as he moves through adolescence toward adulthood. A psychologist would note that this representation is more realistic than stories that present trauma recovery as quick or simple, or that suggest trauma can be completely overcome and left behind. Real trauma recovery is typically a long, difficult process that requires time, safety, support, and often professional help. Even with appropriate treatment and support, trauma often leaves lasting effects on personality and functioning that the person carries throughout their life. Morty's story also illustrates how trauma affects development in particularly profound ways when it occurs during critical developmental periods. Morty is going through adolescence, a period when the brain is undergoing significant development, particularly in areas related to emotional regulation, decision-making, and identity formation. The trauma he experiences is not happening to a fully formed adult with established coping mechanisms, stable identity, and mature brain functioning. It is happening to a teenager whose brain and personality are still actively developing and being shaped by experiences. A psychologist would observe that trauma during developmental periods has particularly profound effects because it shapes the person during the time when fundamental aspects of self and personality are being formed. The neural pathways being created, the personality characteristics being solidified, the relationship patterns being established. All of these are being influenced by trauma during Morty's adolescent years. The Morty who emerges from adolescence into adulthood will be fundamentally different from who he might have become without these traumatic experiences shaping his development. The show uses humor and absurdity alongside serious psychological themes, which might seem contradictory or might suggest the psychological content is not meant to be taken seriously. However, a psychologist would observe that this blend actually reflects how people cope with trauma in real life. Humor can be a coping mechanism that helps people manage distress and maintain some sense of control or perspective during difficult experiences. The show's blend of comedy and serious psychological content mirrors how real people often use humor to cope with trauma while simultaneously struggling with genuine psychological pain. The comedy does not negate the psychological truth being explored. Instead, it makes that truth more accessible and more tolerable to explore. Morty's explicit recognition that he has PTSD in Season 8 represents a level of self-awareness that is psychologically significant. Many people who experience trauma do not recognize their symptoms as trauma responses, or do not have language to describe what they are experiencing. They may know something is wrong, that they are struggling more than they used to, that their emotions or behaviors have changed. Yet they do not connect these changes to trauma or understand them as symptoms of a recognized condition. The fact that Morty can name his condition using clinical terminology suggests either that he has learned about PTSD through some source of information, such as school, media, or conversations with others, or that his symptoms have become severe, enough that he sought information to understand what was happening to him. A psychologist would observe that self-awareness about trauma is an important step that can motivate seeking help, can provide some sense of understanding and control over confusing symptoms, and can help the person recognize that their struggles are not personal failings, but responses to abnormal circumstances. The patterns we have observed in Morty's behavior across seasons illustrate how trauma creates changes across multiple domains of functioning simultaneously, rather than affecting just one area of life. Trauma does not just affect emotions, or just affect relationships, or just affect identity, or just affect daily functioning. It affects all these domains together, creating complex interactions where problems in one area create or worsen problems in other areas. Morty's emotional numbing affects his relationships because he cannot connect emotionally with others. His relationship difficulties affect his identity because he struggles to understand who he is in relation to others. His identity confusion affects his functioning because he lacks clear sense of self to guide decisions and behavior. All these issues together create a complex web of difficulties that cannot be addressed by fixing just one aspect in isolation. A psychologist would recognize this as representing the reality of how trauma affects people comprehensively rather than in isolated ways, requiring interventions that address the whole person rather than single symptoms. Morty's story across 8 seasons ultimately serves as an extended exploration of trauma and its psychological effects, using the vehicle of animated sci-fi comedy to make these effects visible and dramatic. The show presents trauma not as a single event, but as an ongoing condition that persists over time. It presents trauma not as something that happens in isolation, but as something that occurs in relationship contexts, and that affects all relationships. It presents trauma not as something that can be easily fixed through simple solutions, but as something that fundamentally changes who a person is at a core level. A psychologist would observe that these representations, while exaggerated and presented through fantastical scenarios, capture important truths about trauma psychology that can help viewers understand these issues in themselves or others. It is important to emphasize clearly that what we have presented in this analysis is an interpretation of story behavior and character development, not a clinical diagnosis. Morty is a fictional character created by writers, and the patterns we observe are created by those writers for storytelling purposes, rather than being real clinical presentations from actual patients. However, a psychologist would note that the patterns the writers have created are grounded in real psychological phenomena and accurately represent how trauma affects people in ways consistent with research and clinical observation. The show uses fiction to explore truth about human psychology and human responses to repeated traumatic experiences. Morty's character development across the series demonstrates how someone changes when exposed to chronic trauma during adolescence, how personality is shaped by experiences beyond our control, how relationships are affected by unprocessed psychological pain, and how people struggle to maintain functioning and identity while carrying the weight of accumulated traumatic experiences. These themes resonate with audiences because they reflect real human struggles that many people face in various forms, even if the specific circumstances of Morty's trauma are fantastical and exaggerated for dramatic effect. The psychological truth underneath the sci-fi adventure makes Morty's story more than just entertainment. It becomes a way to understand and discuss trauma psychology through the lens of fiction that makes complex psychological concepts accessible. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.